Carl Jung. The universe breaks you only to build you higher. There's a secret that Carl Jung discovered in the early 20th century, a secret so radical, so psychologically destabilizing, that the entire self-help industry has spent decades trying to bury it beneath mountains of positive affirmations and manifestation mantras. And that secret is this: the universe doesn't break you randomly, it breaks you surgically, precisely, at the exact points where your false self has calcified into armor. What you call your worst moment, that rock-bottom experience you're ashamed to talk about at dinner parties, wasn't a mistake. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't even punishment. It was an excavation, a controlled demolition of the prison you've been living inside, mistaking it for a palace. Jung wrote in his Red Book, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. Not suffering for suffering's sake, but pain with purpose. The kind of breaking that feels like dying because something actually is dying. The version of you that was never real to begin with." Let me tell you about David. David was a successful architect in his early 40s, the kind of man who looked perfect on paper. 6-figure salary, beautiful home in the suburbs, wife, 2 kids, respected in his field. He designed buildings that won awards, structures that would outlast him, and every night he would sit in his car in the driveway for 20 minutes before going inside, feeling absolutely nothing. Not sadness, not frustration, nothing. A void where his life should be. And then it all collapsed. Within 6 months, David's firm went bankrupt due to his partner's embezzlement. His marriage fell apart when his wife admitted she'd been having an affair for 2 years. His health deteriorated. Panic attacks, insomnia, a body that was finally refusing to cooperate with the lie. From the outside, it looked like David's life was destroyed. From the inside, something else was happening, something Jung understood but rarely spoke about in simple terms. David wasn't being destroyed, he was being deconstructed, disassembled at the joints where his persona, his social mask, had fused with his actual identity. See, David had spent 20 years building a perfect life that belonged to someone else. The successful architect persona wasn't his authentic desire. It was his father's unlived dream. The stable marriage wasn't built on truth. It was built on fear of disappointing others. Even his children, whom he loved, had become props in a performance of normalcy. The universe didn't break David out of cruelty. It broke him because that was the only language his unconscious could use to get his attention. This is what Jung meant when he said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." David thought he was living his life. In reality, his life was living him. And the breaking, the collapse of everything he'd built, was actually the moment his real life was trying to begin. Now, pause for a moment. If you're watching this video, there's a reason. You're either in your breaking right now, or you've been through one and you're trying to understand what the hell just happened. Maybe you lost your job. Maybe a relationship exploded. Maybe you woke up one morning and realized you don't recognize the person in the mirror anymore. Comment "breaking" if you're in this moment right now. Not because I need engagement, but because naming it matters. Acknowledging that you're in the void is the first act of consciousness. Here's what the self-help industry won't tell you. You can't think your way out of this. You can't manifest your way past it. You can't positive affirmation yourself into wholeness. Because what's happening to you isn't a problem to be solved. It's an initiation to be undergone. Jung spent years studying the mystery traditions, alchemy, and ancient wisdom teachings, and he discovered that every culture in human history understood something we've forgotten. Transformation requires death, not physical death, but ego death. The dismantling of who you thought you were so that who you actually are can emerge. The ancient alchemists called it solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate, break down the base material so it can be reformed into gold. The Christians called it crucifixion before resurrection. The Buddhists call it ego dissolution. Jung called it individuation, the process of becoming a whole, integrated human being. And it always, always begins with a breaking. But here's the forbidden part, the piece that makes this dangerous knowledge. The breaking isn't random. Your unconscious psyche, the vast, intelligent ocean beneath your conscious awareness, orchestrates these collapses with precision. It identifies where you're most rigidly identified with a false self, and it targets that exact structure. For David, it was the successful professional identity and the stable family man mask. For others, it might be the beautiful body, the sharp intellect, the spiritual persona, the rebel identity, the caretaker role. Whatever you're most attached to, whatever you've built your entire sense of self upon, that's what gets taken, not to destroy you, but to free you. Jung observed this pattern so consistently in his patients that he came to understand the psyche itself as self-regulating. It has its own intelligence, its own agenda, and when the conscious ego becomes too identified with a partial, limited version of the self, the unconscious intervenes. Through dreams, through symptoms, through synchronicities, and when all else fails, through crisis. Your breakdown is actually your psyche's breakthrough attempt. Think about it. How many people do you know who are sleepwalking through life? Going through the motions, playing roles they never consciously chose, wearing masks they can no longer remove because the mask has become their face. They're not happy, but they're not unhappy enough to change. They're comfortable in their prison. The breaking is what happens when your soul refuses to be comfortable anymore. David told me years later, after he'd done the work of integration, that the collapse of his life was the most painful and most necessary thing that ever happened to him, because it forced him to ask a question he'd been avoiding for 40 years. Who am I when everything I've built is gone? That's the question the breaking demands you answer. Not who you were, not who you're supposed to be, who you actually are beneath all the conditioning, all the expectations, all the masks. And you can't answer that question from inside the prison. The walls have to come down first. This is the architecture of transformation that Jung mapped. This is the hidden intelligence behind your suffering. And over the next 2 hours, we're going to decode it together. We're going to explore why you had to be shattered, what your crisis was really showing you, and how to rebuild from authentic ground instead of constructing another beautiful prison. But I need you to understand something before we go deeper. This isn't information. This is initiation. The fact that you're still watching means you're ready for what comes next. Or at least, some part of you is. Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But he also knew that privilege comes with a price. The price is everything false, everything comfortable, everything you've been pretending to be. The universe breaks you at the points where you're most fake, and it does this not as punishment, but as liberation. Welcome to the architecture of your transformation. Let's begin. In 1912, Carl Jung coined the term persona from the Latin word for mask, the theatrical masks actors wore in ancient Greek and Roman drama to signify their character. But Jung wasn't talking about theater. He was talking about the mask you wear every single day, the one you've been wearing so long you've forgotten it's a mask at all. The persona is the face you show the world, the professional you at work, the dutiful you with family, the fun you with friends, the spiritual you on social media, the successful you in public. These aren't necessarily false. They're roles you play to navigate social reality. Jung understood that we need personas to function in civilization. The problem begins when the mask fuses with your face, when you can't take it off anymore. Let me introduce you to Sarah. Sarah was a corporate executive at a Fortune 500 company, 43 years old, vice president of operations. She'd climbed the ladder with ruthless efficiency, MBA from a top school, 60-hour work weeks, strategic networking, calculated career moves. She was known in her industry as brilliant, driven, uncompromising, the kind of woman who walked into boardrooms and commanded immediate respect. Her persona was immaculate, tailored suits, perfect makeup, controlled emotional expression, strategic vulnerability deployed only when it served advancement. She'd built this identity deliberately over 2 decades, believing that success required becoming this version of herself. And it worked. By every external measure, Sarah had won. But here's what no one saw. Sarah couldn't sleep without medication. She had a drinking problem she rationalized as executive stress management. Her relationships were transactional. Her children barely knew her. And somewhere deep inside, beneath all the armor, there was a part of her that wanted to scream. The persona was a prison, but the doors were locked from the inside. Jung observed that the persona serves a critical function in early life. You need to develop a functional social identity to survive and succeed in the world. The young person must learn the language of their culture, adopt appropriate roles, master the art of fitting in. This isn't hypocrisy, it's development. But Jung also recognized that what's necessary in the first half of life becomes a trap in the second half. The persona that helped you succeed in your 20s and 30s becomes the cage that prevents your development in your 40s and beyond. The mask that once protected you now suffocates you. This is what Jung meant when he identified the midlife crisis not as a problem, but as a developmental necessity. The psyche is trying to break you out of the persona prison. Your soul is staging a prison break, and the crisis is the tunnel being dug beneath your carefully constructed identity. Sarah's breaking came during a corporate retreat. She was giving a presentation on operational efficiency, a subject she'd mastered, a performance she'd executed hundreds of times. Halfway through, standing at the podium in front of 200 colleagues, she simply stopped. Not because she forgot her lines, because something inside her couldn't continue the performance. She stood there in silence for what felt like an eternity. Then she walked off the stage, left the building, drove home, and didn't go back to work for 3 months. The persona had cracked. Now, here's what's crucial to understand. Jung identified 5 primary masks that most people die inside of. 5 persona prisons that keep you from becoming whole. And the universe identifies which prison you're in and targets that exact structure. The first mask is the achiever. This is Sarah's prison. The identity built entirely on external success, accomplishment, and recognition. The achiever believes they are what they accomplish. Remove the achievements, and there's nothing left. This persona demands constant validation through performance. It cannot rest. It cannot be vulnerable. It cannot simply exist without producing value. The breaking for the achiever comes when achievement stops working, when the promotion feels empty, when the award means nothing, when success loses its meaning and you realize you've been climbing a ladder leaned against the wrong building. The second mask is the caretaker, the person whose entire identity is built on being needed. They derive their sense of worth from helping, fixing, and saving others. Their persona is selfless, compassionate, always available. But beneath the surface, there's exhaustion and resentment. They've abandoned their own needs so completely they no longer know what they need. The breaking for the caretaker comes when the people they've been saving reject their help, when their children grow up and don't need them anymore, when they realize their entire identity was built on other people's problems, and without those problems, they don't know who they are. The third mask is the intellectual, the person who lives entirely in their head, using intelligence and analysis to navigate reality while avoiding emotional experience. They pride themselves on rationality, logic, and being the smartest person in the room. but they're disconnected from their bodies, their emotions, their instincts. The breaking for the intellectual comes when life presents a problem that cannot be thought through, a loss that cannot be rationalized, an emotion so overwhelming that analysis fails, the moment when the mind realizes it cannot control everything and the body demands to be felt. The fourth mask is the rebel, the person whose identity is built on opposition. They define themselves by what they're against rather than what they're for. Their persona is nonconformist, countercultural, edgy, but it's still a mask, just the inverse of conventional masks. They're still performing, just for a different audience. The breaking for the rebel comes when rebellion itself becomes conformity, when they realize their authentic identity is just another set of rules, when they understand that defining yourself by opposition is still letting others define you. The fifth mask is the spiritual seeker, the person who's transcended all those other false identities and become enlightened, awakened, conscious. Their persona is evolved, high vibration, beyond ego. But this is often the most insidious mask of all, the ego pretending it doesn't have an ego. The breaking for the spiritual seeker comes when their spiritual identity is revealed as another performance, when their enlightenment is exposed as bypassing, when they're confronted with the shadow material they've been spiritually circumventing. Pause here and ask yourself honestly, which mask are you wearing right now? Don't rush past this. This might be the most important question in this entire script, because you cannot break out of a prison you don't know you're in. Are you the achiever, building your entire sense of worth on external accomplishment? Are you the caretaker, losing yourself in service to others? Are you the intellectual, using your mind to avoid your heart? Are you the rebel, defining yourself by opposition? Are you the spiritual seeker, using consciousness as a new identity to hide behind? Sarah realized she was the achiever, and the moment she named it, the moment she recognized that her executive persona was a mask she could no longer remove, she understood why the universe had to shatter it, because she'd confused the role with her essence. She'd mistaken the performance for the performer. Jung developed a concept he called the mask maintenance cost, the psychic energy required to sustain a false identity. And here's the thing, the persona is expensive. It demands constant monitoring, constant performance, constant vigilance. You have to remember your lines. You have to stay in character. You have to make sure no one sees what's behind the mask. This maintenance cost drains your life force. It's why so many successful people are exhausted, why so many helpers are depleted, why so many intelligent people are numb, why so many rebels are angry, why so many spiritual seekers are anxious. The mask is expensive and you're paying with your aliveness. Sarah spent 20 years maintaining her executive persona. Every morning she would put herself together, a phrase that reveals the fragmentation underneath. She wasn't whole, she was assembled. Every interaction required calculation. Every emotion had to be screened for appropriateness. Every vulnerability had to be strategically deployed or completely suppressed. By the time she walked off that stage, the maintenance cost had bankrupted her psychically. Jung used vivid metaphors to describe the persona prison. He talked about crystallized armor, how the mask hardens over time, becoming less flexible, more rigid. What started as a protective layer becomes a shell you cannot shed. He described painted over windows, how the persona obscures your view of your inner world. You're so busy managing the external image that you lose contact with internal reality. The breaking is when the armor cracks, when the paint peels, when the mask slips and you catch a glimpse of what's underneath. And what's underneath is always more real, more alive, and more terrifying than the mask. Sarah's 3 months away from work were not a vacation, they were a descent. She stopped performing any of her roles. She didn't answer calls, she didn't maintain friendships. She stopped being the executive, the mother, the wife, the colleague. She let all the masks fall, and in that naked space she met herself for the first time in 20 years. Here's the paradox Jung identified. The persona is both necessary and imprisoning. You need social masks to function in collective reality. Complete personalessness is psychosis. You'd be unable to navigate any social interaction. But complete identification with the persona is also a kind of psychosis. You've lost contact with the authentic self beneath the roles. The goal isn't to eliminate the persona. It's to remember it's a mask, to be able to put it on and take it off consciously, to know the difference between the role you're playing and the person playing the role. This is what Sarah had to learn in her breaking. Not to stop being an executive, but to stop being only an executive. Not to reject competence, but to reject the belief that competence was her essence. Not to eliminate the mask, but to recognize it as a mask. Jung wrote, "The persona is a complicated system of relations between individual consciousness and society. Fittingly enough, a kind of mask designed on the one hand to make a definite impression upon others, and on the other, to conceal the true nature of the individual." Read that again. The persona makes an impression on others while concealing your true nature, from yourself and from everyone else. Your breaking wasn't random, it was targeted. The universe identified where your mask had fused with your face and applied pressure to that exact point. Because the only way to free you from a prison you've mistaken for a palace is to collapse the walls. For David, it was the successful architect and stable family man masks. For Sarah, it was the powerful executive persona. For you, it's whichever identity you've built your entire sense of self upon. And the breaking is necessary because that identity was never real to begin with. It was a role you played so well for so long that you forgot you were acting. The universe doesn't break who you really are. It breaks who you're pretending to be. This is why your crisis felt so devastating. Not because you lost something essential, but because you believed the mask was essential. The death feels total because you've been identifying with something that was always temporary. But here's the gift hidden in the devastation. When the mask cracks, light gets in, and light gets out. Sarah told me that during those 3 months, she would sit in her backyard and do nothing, just sit. And at first, it felt like dying. The absence of performance felt like the absence of self. But gradually, something else began to emerge. Not the executive, not any role at all. Just presence, awareness, being. She described it as meeting someone I used to know a long time ago. That someone was her, before the masks, before the performance, before the maintenance cost bankrupted her aliveness. Jung called this the self with a capital S, the authentic organizing center of your psyche beneath all the personas. And the breaking is what happens when the self refuses to be ignored anymore. Your false self had to be shattered because your true self was trying to be born. Now, before we go deeper, I want to acknowledge something. Letting go of the persona is terrifying because the mask isn't just protection from others, it's protection from yourself. Behind the persona is everything you've been afraid to be. Everything you've been taught is unacceptable, everything you've disowned. Jung had a name for that shadow material behind the mask, and that's where we're going next. But first, pause and ask yourself one more time, what mask have I been wearing, and what would it cost me to let it crack? Write it down, say it out loud, comment it below, because naming the prison is the first act of freedom. Now we arrive at the most dangerous piece of Jungian psychology, the concept that will either liberate you or destroy your remaining sense of innocence. Because once you understand what I'm about to explain, you can never see your life or your crises the same way again. Carl Jung discovered that beneath every persona, hidden in the basement of your psyche, lives everything you've disowned about yourself. He called it the shadow, not evil, not demonic, but rejected. The parts of you that didn't fit the mask, the qualities your family couldn't accept, the impulses society punished, the aspects of your nature you learned to be ashamed of. And here's the forbidden truth. Your crisis didn't happen to you. It happened for you, specifically targeting the exact qualities you've been projecting onto others instead of integrating within yourself. Let me take you back to David. Remember, David was the successful architect whose life imploded. Firm bankruptcy, marriage collapse, health crisis. From the outside, it looked like bad luck, terrible timing, unfair circumstances. But Jung would have asked a different question. What was David's unconscious trying to show him? During his breakdown, David became obsessed with one particular thought. He couldn't stop thinking about his former business partner, the man whose embezzlement destroyed their firm. David would lie awake at night, consumed with rage at this man's betrayal, his recklessness, his selfishness, his complete lack of integrity. How could someone be so careless? David would ask himself. How could someone destroy something we built together just to serve their own impulses? 6 months into therapy, David's analyst asked him a simple question. What if your partner wasn't your enemy? What if he was your mirror? David was furious at this suggestion. His partner had literally stolen from him. This wasn't metaphorical. This was real betrayal. But the analyst persisted. I'm not asking you to excuse what he did. I'm asking you to explore why this particular betrayal devastated you so completely. Out of all the ways your life could have fallen apart, why did this specific form of destruction land so heavily? And slowly, painfully, David began to see it. His entire life had been built on control, precision, and rigidity. Every line on his architectural drawings was measured to the millimeter. Every aspect of his life was planned, structured, contained. He'd built his identity on being the opposite of careless, the opposite of impulsive, the opposite of selfish. What his partner represented, chaos, impulsivity, self-serving desire, these weren't just qualities in another person. They were the exact qualities David had exiled from his own psyche, the shadow material he'd spent 40 years repressing. His partner didn't cause David's crisis. His partner revealed what was already true. David's rigid control was unsustainable. His perfectionism was a prison. His selflessness was actually self-abandonment. The reckless, selfish qualities he hated in his partner were the exact qualities his soul was desperate to integrate. This is shadow projection, and it's running your life right now. Jung observed this pattern so consistently that he developed what I call the 3-mirror test. 3 categories of people who reveal your disowned shadow material. The first mirror is the people you hate, the individuals who trigger instant revulsion, anger, or moral judgment. The person at work who's so arrogant, the family member who's so manipulative, the public figure who's so fake. Jung's principle, if you can't look away, if the hatred feels disproportionate, if you need everyone else to agree that this person is terrible, that's your shadow looking back at you, not because you're identical to that person, but because they're embodying a quality you've disowned. The arrogant person might be expressing the healthy confidence you've suppressed. The manipulative person might be displaying the strategic self-interest you've never allowed yourself. The fake person might be showing you the performance you've been running unconsciously. Your hatred is a diagnostic tool. It's your psyche saying, this quality exists in you, and you're terrified to admit it. David hated his partner's recklessness because David had never allowed himself a single reckless moment. He'd spent his entire life being responsible, measured, controlled, and his soul was dying from it. The second mirror is the people you idealize, the individuals you put on pedestals, the mentor who has it all figured out, the artist who's so authentic, the spiritual teacher who's so enlightened. Jung's principle, idealization, is inverted shadow projection. You're attributing to others the qualities you possess but refuse to claim for yourself. When Sarah was building her corporate empire, she had a CEO she idolized, a woman who seemed to balance power and compassion effortlessly. Sarah would study this woman's interviews, analyze her decisions, try to emulate her leadership style. But she always felt like she was falling short. What Sarah didn't realize, the qualities she admired weren't absent in her, they were disowned. She possessed that same potential for balanced leadership, but her persona wouldn't allow it. The achiever mask demanded either ruthless power or compassionate weakness, not both. So she projected the integrated version onto someone else and worshipped it from a distance. Your idealization reveals what you're not letting yourself become. The third mirror is the people you ignore, the individuals who simply don't register on your radar. You don't hate them, you don't admire them, they're just invisible to you. Jung's principle: what you can't see in others, you can't see in yourself. The qualities that don't trigger any response are often the most deeply repressed aspects of your shadow. For David, it was emotional, expressive, spontaneous people. They simply didn't exist in his world. He'd attend social gatherings and literally not remember the people who were laughing loudly, sharing stories, being unfiltered. They didn't compute within his rigid framework. This wasn't conscious dismissal. It was unconscious blindness. His psyche couldn't register what it had completely exiled. Your blind spots in others map your blind spots in yourself. Now, here's where this gets uncomfortable. Ready? Your crisis was orchestrated by your unconscious to force you to integrate your shadow. The universe didn't randomly select your breaking point. It identified the exact area where shadow projection was running your life and applied maximum pressure. David's partner didn't randomly embezzle. He did. But David's unconscious selected this particular relationship dynamic, this particular vulnerability, this particular form of chaos, because it was precisely what David needed to integrate. His soul was suffocating under rigid control, and the only way to crack that armor was through external chaos that mirrored his internal need for liberation. Sarah's affair wasn't just about her husband finding someone else. It was about Sarah discovering that while she was performing success, someone else was experiencing intimacy. The affair revealed what she'd been denying. Her entire life was performance, and she'd lost contact with genuine connection. The shadow quality she'd projected onto her husband's affair partner was authentic emotional availability, the exact quality Sarah had sacrificed for her executive mask. This is the mechanism Jung mapped. This is how the psyche self-corrects. When you exile a quality from consciousness, it doesn't disappear. It goes into the shadow, and from the shadow, it gains power. It influences your life through projection, through symptoms, through seemingly external events that are actually internal pressures seeking release. Let me give you the framework I call shadow mapping. How to read your breakdowns as diagnostic tools. Step 1. Identify what destroyed you, not the surface story but the core wound. Was it betrayal, abandonment, failure, rejection, exposure, loss of control? Step 2. Name the quality you most judge in the person or circumstance that hurt you, the exact trait that makes you say, "I would never be like that." Write it down. Step 3. Find 3 moments in your past where you demonstrated that exact quality, but didn't recognize it as such. This is the hard part. Your ego will resist, but it's essential. The quality you judge most harshly in others is always present in you, just wearing a different costume. David judged recklessness, but when he did this exercise, he realized he'd been reckless with his own well-being, working himself into exhaustion. He'd been reckless with his marriage, ignoring clear signs of disconnection for years. He'd been reckless with his inner life, abandoning his own needs for external achievement. His recklessness looked different than his partner's, but it was equally destructive. Step 4. Ask the dangerous question: what is this crisis trying to make me integrate? Not what did you lose, but what are you being forced to reclaim? For David, spontaneity, emotional expression, self-permission, healthy chaos. For Sarah, vulnerability, authentic connection, imperfection, emotional availability. Your crisis is a curriculum. The universe is not punishing you. It's educating you through the only method guaranteed to work, making the unconscious conscious through unavoidable confrontation. Now, before we go further, I need to give you a serious warning. This knowledge is dangerous. Once you understand shadow projection, you can become insufferable. You can use this framework to spiritually bypass real accountability. You can tell yourself, they're just mirroring my shadow, when someone actually is harming you, and you need to set boundaries. You can use Jung's concepts to avoid taking responsibility for your impact on others. This is what I call the dark side of shadow work, weaponizing psychological concepts to maintain ego superiority in a new disguise. I've seen people learn about projection and then dismiss every criticism as, that's just their shadow. I've seen people use shadow integration language to excuse toxic behavior. I'm just integrating my aggressive shadow, said by someone who's actually just being an asshole without taking responsibility. Jung never intended shadow work to make you morally superior. The entire point is humility. It's recognizing that everything you judge in others exists in you, not to excuse yourself, but to make you more compassionate and more accountable. Real shadow integration makes you softer, not harder, more vulnerable, not more defended, more capable of admitting fault, not better at rationalizing behavior. If shadow work is making you feel more enlightened than others, you're doing it wrong. If it's making you feel more broken and more human, you're on the right path. Sarah learned this the hard way. When she first discovered Jung's work during her 3-month breakdown, she became obsessed with identifying everyone else's shadows. She'd analyze her colleagues, her family, her friends. She'd see their projections everywhere, and it made her feel powerful, like she'd accessed secret knowledge that made her psychologically superior. Her analyst called her out directly. You're using shadow work to build a new persona, the enlightened one who sees through everyone else. This is just another mask, Sarah. And it's more dangerous than the executive persona, because now you're using psychological truth as a weapon. That confrontation devastated her, but it was necessary, because shadow work without humility is just ego with a new vocabulary. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." But the making conscious part is brutal. It's not an intellectual exercise. It's a complete dismantling of your innocence. You have to admit, the person who betrayed you showed you something about yourself. The person who abandoned you revealed what you'd abandoned in yourself. The person who failed you demonstrated where you'd been failing yourself. This doesn't mean they weren't wrong. It doesn't mean you deserved mistreatment. It means that suffering has a second layer of meaning beyond the surface story. And if you're willing to look at that second layer, your crisis stops being random and starts being purposeful. David spent 9 months working with his shadow material. He started small. He let himself be 5 minutes late to an appointment without apologizing profusely. He ordered dessert without justifying it. He went for a drive without a destination. Tiny acts of integrated recklessness that his rigid system had never allowed. And something remarkable happened. The rage at his former partner began to dissolve, not because David excused the embezzlement, but because he understood what that chaos was trying to teach him. His partner was a messenger, not an enemy, a mirror, not a villain, The external destruction was showing him the internal need for liberation. This is the mechanism Jung discovered. This is how your psyche uses external events to communicate internal truths. Your crisis wasn't random suffering, it was targeted medicine. Painful medicine, yes, but medicine nonetheless. Now I want you to do something. Think about the person or situation that broke you, the one you can't stop thinking about, the one that still triggers anger or grief or confusion. What quality in that person or situation do you judge most harshly? Write it down, say it out loud. Now find it in yourself, not the identical expression, but the essence. Where have you demonstrated that quality? Where are you currently demonstrating it without realizing it? This exercise will either liberate you or infuriate you. And if it infuriates you, that's a sign you're touching the shadow. Comment below with the quality you discovered, not for confession but for consciousness, because naming your shadow is the first step in integrating it. Jung's final insight on shadow projection is this: your enemies are your greatest teachers. Not because they're good people, but because they're showing you the exact qualities you need to integrate, to become whole. The universe doesn't break you with random weapons. It breaks you with surgical precision, using the exact shadow material you've been denying. David's partner represented chaos. Sarah's husband's affair partner represented authenticity. Your crisis represents something you've been refusing to integrate. And until you integrate it consciously, your unconscious will keep arranging circumstances that force the issue. This is why patterns repeat. This is why you keep attracting the same type of relationship. This is why you keep finding yourself in the same conflicts. Not because you're cursed, but because you're unconscious. And your psyche is desperately trying to make you conscious through repetition. The breaking is your psyche's last resort. When dreams don't work, when symptoms don't work, when synchronicities don't work, the unconscious arranges a crisis so devastating you cannot ignore it anymore. But here's the gift. Once you understand projection, once you map your shadow, once you start integrating what you've disowned, the external world stops attacking you because there's nothing left to project. The universe only breaks what's false, and shadow projection is one of the falsest things about the human condition. We're going to go deeper now into the actual phenomenology of ego death, the place where David and Sarah both descended, the place you might be in right now. But before we enter that darkness, understand this: you're not being punished, you're being shown, and what you're being shown is the path to wholeness. Jung said it perfectly. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Your crisis made the darkness conscious. Now we have to learn how to sit with it. There's a place in the transformational journey that no one prepares you for. A territory between worlds where you're no longer who you were, but not yet who you're becoming. Jung called it the land of the dead in his Red Book. The mystics called it the dark night of the soul. I call it psychological crucifixion, the period where your ego dies, and you have to endure the dying without knowing if anything will resurrect. If you're in this phase right now, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And if you've been through it, you're probably having visceral memories as I speak these words. This is the phase where David sat in his empty apartment at 3 a.m, staring at walls, feeling absolutely nothing, not sadness, not hope, just void. This is the phase where Sarah stopped showering for days, stopped answering her phone, stopped performing any function beyond basic survival. From the outside, it looks like depression. From the inside, it's something different, something more profound and more necessary than clinical depression, though the symptoms overlap. Jung differentiated between two types of psychological breaking. There's breaking down and there's breaking open. Understanding this difference might be the most important thing I tell you today. Breaking down is collapse without purpose. It's the structural failure of your psyche when it's been damaged beyond its capacity to self-regulate. This requires intervention, therapy, medication, community support. This is not what we're talking about when we discuss transformational crisis. Breaking open is controlled dismantling. It's your psyche deliberately disassembling the structures that have become prisons. It feels like breaking down. The symptoms are nearly identical, but the mechanism underneath is different. This is transformational crisis. This is ego death. This is the death phase. How do you tell the difference? Jung offered one key diagnostic. Does some part of you, however small, sense that this darkness has intelligence? Does something beneath the suffering feel purposeful, even if you can't articulate the purpose? If yes, you're breaking open. Your psyche is initiating you into a deeper level of consciousness. If no, if the darkness feels only random and destructive, seek professional help immediately. What I'm describing requires discernment. David knew he was breaking open because even in his darkest moments he had a strange sense of rightness. Not happiness, rightness. Like his life was finally being honest after decades of lying. Sarah knew because she kept thinking, I deserve this. Not as punishment, but as truth. Like the void was stripping away everything false, and what remained might actually be real. The death phase has 3 distinct stages. Jung mapped these in his own breakdown between 1913 and 1917, when he lost his mentor, his marriage stability, and his connection to consensual reality. He documented the entire process, and it became the foundation for his understanding of transformation. Stage 1 is denial. This is where you keep trying to fix things using the old operating system. Your marriage is ending, and you're reading relationship books as if information will solve what's actually a soul-level mismatch. Your career has imploded, and you're sending out resumes as if another job will address what's actually a calling-level crisis. You're frantically trying to rebuild what the universe just dismantled. This stage is characterized by anxiety, hyperactivity, desperate strategizing. You cannot sit still because sitting still means feeling the truth. Something fundamental has died, and no amount of fixing will resurrect it. David spent 2 months in this stage. He'd make lists of actions to take. Find new business partners. Fix his marriage through couples counseling. Get his health back through exercise and supplements. He treated his crisis like a logistical problem with logistical solutions. It didn't work because the crisis wasn't logistical. It was existential. Stage 2 is dissolution. This is where you finally stop fighting and let yourself fall. The denial mechanisms exhaust themselves, and you enter a period of profound letting go. Not peaceful letting go, more like drowning while you stop struggling against the water. This stage feels like death because you're experiencing ego dissolution. The structure you've been calling I is coming apart. Your beliefs about who you are, what matters, what's true, all of it becomes liquid. Solid ground disappears. Jung described this stage using alchemical imagery. The nigredo, the blackening phase where all material decomposes into base matter before it can be transformed into gold. Everything you've built, everything you've believed, everything you've identified with, it all rots back into undifferentiated potential. For David, dissolution began when he stopped trying to fix anything. He stopped making lists. He stopped strategizing. He just sat with the wreckage of his life and let himself feel it completely. The grief wasn't about what he'd lost. It was deeper than that. It was grief about who he'd never actually been. All those years of achievement, of marriage, of fatherhood, he realized he'd been absent for his own life. That realization doesn't just hurt. It obliterates. It's not, I lost my life. It's, I never had my life to begin with. For Sarah, dissolution came in the form of a complete collapse of meaning. Success meant nothing. Relationships meant nothing. Her children whom she loved felt like strangers, not because she stopped caring, but because the frameworks through which she'd interpreted caring had dissolved. She couldn't be the mother she'd performed being. She couldn't be the wife she'd pretended to be. She could only sit in her backyard and exist without role, without identity, without purpose. This is the stage where people say things like, "I don't know who I am anymore," and they mean it literally. The ego structure that organized their experience has decomposed, and they're experiencing raw, unorganized consciousness without the usual filters. It's terrifying, and it's necessary. Jung wrote, "The word happiness would lose its meaning if it were not balanced by sadness." But he also understood that there are forms of sadness that transcend personal loss. There's a sadness that comes from finally seeing truth, a grief that accompanies the death of illusion. This is that grief. You're not mourning what you lost in your crisis. You're mourning what you never actually had. The false self, the persona, the life you thought you were living but were actually performing. And this is why well-meaning people can't help you during this phase. They'll say things like, "You'll get through this," or "Time heals all wounds," or "Everything happens for a reason." And these platitudes feel like violence because they're attempting to console you for the wrong death. You're not mourning a loss, you're mourning an illusion, and the only way through is complete dissolution of that illusion. Stage 3 is the void. This is the bottom, the place where there's no movement in any direction, no progress, no regression, just emptiness. Some people stay here for days, some for months. Jung was here for nearly 4 years. The void is characterized by absolute flatness of affect. No highs, no lows, just gray existence. You're not suicidal, but you're not particularly invested in being alive either. You perform basic functions, eating, sleeping, basic hygiene, but there's no aliveness in any of it. David described it as being a ghost in my own life. He'd watch his children playing and feel nothing. He'd eat food and taste nothing. He'd have conversations and hear nothing. He was technically functional, but existentially absent. Sarah said it felt like living in a waiting room. Everything had the quality of temporary, like she was between realities, but couldn't see either the one she'd left or the one she was entering. This is the most dangerous stage because from the outside, you look recovered. You're functioning again, going through motions, but inside, you're in complete existential suspension. Jung called this the land of the dead because you're neither fully alive nor fully willing to die. You exist in a liminal space that has no language in our normal psychological vocabulary. Here's what's actually happening in the void. Your psyche is rebuilding its foundation. The old operating system has been uninstalled, and new source code is being written. But there's a gap, a period where neither system is running. You're operating on minimal consciousness while major renovations occur beneath awareness. This is why nothing makes sense in the void. Your old frameworks for meaning are gone, and new frameworks haven't emerged yet. Your consciousness without structure, awareness without interpretation, experience without meaning, and you have to endure this. There's no way to speed it up, no way to think your way out, no spiritual practice or therapeutic technique that will abbreviate this stage. You can only consciously suffer through it, knowing that something is happening even though you can't see what. Jung learned during his own breakdown that the void has sacred function. It's not empty, it's pregnant. It's the womb space where the new self gestates. But from inside the womb, there's only darkness. You have to trust a process you cannot perceive. Now, if you're in the void right now, let me tell you something you desperately need to hear. You're not broken. You're between worlds. The flatness you're experiencing isn't depression in the clinical sense. It's decomposition before recomposition. It's the space between death and resurrection. It's necessary darkness, not pathological darkness. But, and this is critical, you must stay vigilant. The void can become the grave if you're not careful. Some people enter the void and never leave because they mistake it for their destination rather than their passage. How do you know if you're in sacred void versus dangerous depression? Again, Jung's diagnostic. Does some small part of you sense that you're waiting for something? Even if you don't know what? Even if you don't believe anything is coming? If yes, you're in the void. Stay there. Endure it. Let it do its work. If no, if there's only ending without beginning, only death without rebirth, get help. The void and clinical depression can coexist, and one requires patience while the other requires intervention. Sarah had one moment in the void that changed everything. She was sitting in her backyard, feeling absolutely nothing, when a bird landed on her fence. Just a common bird. Nothing special, but she watched it for 5 minutes straight. Just watched it exist without effort, without performance, without purpose beyond existing. And something in her thought, that's enough. Just existing is enough. Not philosophically, not as an insight, just as a barely perceptible shift in her relationship to being alive. That was the first whisper of what comes next, the first indication that something new was forming in the darkness. For David, it came when he was drawing one night, something he hadn't done since college. Not architectural plans, just drawing, lines and shapes with no purpose. And he realized he'd been crying while he drew. Not sad crying, not happy crying, just crying, feeling. After months of feeling nothing, something was moving through him again. These are the signs that the void is ending, not dramatic revelations, just tiny movements of aliveness returning, small sensations that indicate the new self is crowning. Jung called these moments messages from the self, the deeper organizing center of the psyche, sending signals that the reconstruction has begun. But here's what you need to understand. The void ends when it ends. You cannot force it. You cannot bypass it. You can only endure it consciously, knowing that endurance itself is the work. This is psychological crucifixion, the death of who you thought you were, the dissolution of your identity, the void where nothing exists. And somewhere in that darkness, without your permission, without your effort, something new begins to emerge. Not the old you rebuilt, something you've never met before. Jung called it the self with a capital S, the authentic organizing center of your psyche that was buried beneath all the personas, all the projections, all the false identities. And meeting the self, actually encountering who you are beyond all conditioning, is the most numinous, terrifying, and sacred experience a human being can have. That's where we're going next. Into the emergence, into the meeting, into the moment when everything changes. But first, if you're in the void, I want you to comment below, I'm in the waiting room, not for consolation, for witness, because being seen in the void makes it slightly less alone. And if you've been through the void and emerged, comment, I've been to the land of the dead, because those who've returned have a responsibility to leave markers for those still crossing. The void is not the end, it's the middle. And in the middle of your darkest darkness, something impossible is being born. There's a moment in the transformational journey that changes everything. A moment so profound that people struggle for years to find language for it. Jung spent his entire career trying to articulate what happens when the ego finally stops running the show and encounters something infinitely larger than itself. He called it meeting the self with a capital S. Not your small self, the ego, the I, you've been identifying with your whole life. The self is the organizing center of the total psyche, the authentic core of who you are beneath every persona, every projection, every defensive structure. There's a moment that comes after the breaking, after you've sat in the wreckage of who you thought you were, After you've confronted your shadow and learned to live without the mask, it's a moment of quiet, almost anticlimactic. You look around at your life and think, now what? And that's when the real work begins. Because here's what nobody tells you about psychological death and rebirth. It's not a one-time event. It's not something you graduate from. You don't break open once, integrate your shadow, and then coast into enlightened retirement. That's the fantasy. That's the ego's last desperate hope, that there's a finish line to consciousness. But Jung knew differently. He called the ongoing work individuation, and he spent his entire life not just studying it, but living it. Even at 80, Carl Jung was still meeting new aspects of himself in dreams, still confronting shadows he hadn't seen before, still becoming. Listen carefully to what he said. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are, not who you were, not who you will be, who you are, which is always unfolding, always revealing, always asking you to go deeper. Individuation is the lifelong project of becoming psychologically whole. It's the work of integrating every part of yourself, the persona you show the world, the shadow you hide from it, the anima or animus within you, and eventually, if you're willing, the self that lies beyond all of them. It's not a straight line. It's not even a circle. It's a spiral. And here's the beautiful, terrifying truth. Every time you reach a new level of consciousness, you'll be asked to break open again. Let me show you what this looks like. Remember Sarah, the executive who built her life on the mask of perfection, only to watch it shatter during that panic attack at the board meeting? She did the work. She really did. She sat with her grief. She learned to recognize when the achiever was driving. She started saying no. She began building a life based on what actually mattered to her rather than what looked impressive. And for a while, it worked. She felt lighter, more authentic. She reconnected with her husband, started painting again, something she'd loved as a teenager, but abandoned because it wasn't productive. She even reduced her hours at work, gave up a promotion she didn't actually want, and found herself breathing easier for the first time in years. 6 months later, her company exploded in growth. They needed her. They really needed her. And this time, it wasn't about ego, or so she told herself. This time, she could help guide the company through a crucial transition. This time, she'd be doing it from a place of integration, not compensation. So she said yes, and within 3 months, she was back. Not completely. Not the old Sarah, but the achiever had rebuilt itself, this time wearing the costume of conscious leadership. She was meditating before meetings, talking about authentic culture, using the language of integration, but underneath, the same compulsive drive, the same inability to rest, the same terror of being ordinary. She was working 18-hour days again, just with better PR. This is what Jung meant when he said, individuation is a spiral. You don't conquer the shadow once and move on. You meet it at deeper and deeper levels. Each time you ascend to a new altitude of consciousness, you'll find the same patterns waiting for you. Just more subtle, more sophisticated, more convincing. The ego is a master of adaptation. It learns your spiritual vocabulary. It dresses itself in the language of authenticity. And if you're not paying attention, you'll rebuild the same prison you just escaped. You'll just call it something else this time. So how do you know when you're genuinely individuating versus when you're just rearranging the furniture in the same old house? Jung gave us a framework. Not a checklist, he was too wise for that, but a pattern. A recognition that individuation moves through stages, and each stage requires its own kind of breaking. The first stage is differentiation from the collective. This is where most people spend their entire lives without ever getting past it. It's the work of recognizing that you have a persona, that the role you play in the world is not who you are. It's seeing that the values you inherited from your family, your culture, your society, they may not actually be yours. This stage often arrives as crisis. The mask stops working. The script you've been following leads to a dead end. And you're forced to ask, who am I underneath all this? David experienced this when his construction company collapsed. Sarah, when her body rebelled against the perfection machine. This is the breaking we've been tracking throughout this entire journey. And for many people, just getting here, just recognizing that they've been living someone else's life, is revolutionary. But it's only the beginning. The second stage is confronting the shadow. This is where you meet all the parts of yourself you've disowned, denied, or projected onto others. The anger you've repressed, the creativity you've dismissed as impractical, the vulnerability you've armored against, the desires you've deemed unacceptable. Jung said, everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. This stage requires brutal honesty. It requires you to take back your projections, to stop seeing your darkness in other people and start seeing it in yourself. It requires you to integrate what you've split off, not to become your shadow, not to act out every impulse, but to acknowledge it, to bring it into consciousness, to stop being controlled by what you refuse to see. Most people who attempt transformation get stuck here. They glimpse their shadow and either recoil in horror, rebuilding the persona even stronger, or they identify with the shadow and mistake acting out for integration. Neither path leads to wholeness. True integration means holding the tension, saying, yes, I contain this darkness. Yes, I contain this light, and I am larger than both. The third stage is encountering the anima, or animus. For men, it's meeting the feminine within. For women, the masculine. This isn't about gender roles or stereotypes. It's about psychological completion. It's about recognizing that your conscious identity is only one polarity, and there's an entire opposite principle living in your unconscious, trying to get your attention. For David, this meant learning to receive, to stop solving everything, to let himself be held in the sacred space his wife created, rather than always being the one who builds and protects. It meant honoring emotion not as weakness but as information. It meant becoming whole by integrating what he'd dismissed as not masculine. For Sarah, it meant reclaiming her inner authority, her ability to assert, to direct, to make decisions from her own center rather than seeking approval. She'd spent so long performing for others that her inner masculine, the part that says, this is my direction and I'm taking it, had atrophied. Learning to trust that inner voice, even when it contradicted what others wanted from her, was its own kind of rebirth. This stage is subtle. It often happens through relationships. You project your anima or animus onto romantic partners until you realize you're chasing something inside yourself, or through dreams, where these figures appear as guides, lovers, teachers, or adversaries. Jung devoted decades to dialoguing with his anima. He knew that becoming whole meant integrating both principles within himself. The fourth stage, and there is no final stage, only deeper spirals, is approaching the self. Capital S, not the ego self, the I that you think you are, but the self, the organizing center of the entire psyche, the totality, the source. Jung said, the self is our life's goal, for it is the completest expression of that fateful combination we call individuality. It's the you that was there before you built a personality, the you that will remain when the personality dissolves. It's not something you achieve, it's what you've always been. Once you remove all the layers of conditioning and defense and false identity, meeting the self doesn't feel like accomplishment. It feels like remembering. It feels like coming home to something you never actually left. And here's the paradox. The more you approach the self, the less special you feel. Because you realize you're not a separate, heroic individual conquering consciousness. You're a temporary expression of something vast, ancient, and universal. This is the true death of ego inflation, not humiliation, but humility, not smallness, but right-sizedness. You matter immensely, and you're also just one wave in an infinite ocean. Let me tell you what happened when Sarah recognized she was spiraling back into her old pattern. She was sitting in her car after another late night at the office. She'd been crying, not the cathartic kind of crying, but the exhausted, frustrated kind. The kind that says, "I thought I was past this." And she heard herself saying out loud, "I'm supposed to be better than this now." And then she stopped, because she heard it. That phrase, "supposed to be." She'd been treating her own transformation like another achievement, another mountain to summit. She'd read the books, done the therapy, confronted her shadow, and now she expected to be done, fixed, graduated. But individuation doesn't work like that. Jung once wrote, "The psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate." Sarah's inner situation, her belief that she could outrun the achiever by achieving spiritual integration, was playing out as fate. She was recreating the exact dynamic she thought she'd transcended. But this time something was different. This time she recognized the pattern, not after months or years of suffering, but in real time. In that car, in that parking lot, she saw clearly, "I'm doing it again. I'm building a new mask. And it's more dangerous than the last one because it looks like consciousness." That recognition, that's the spiral working. That's the gift of having done the work before. You don't avoid the patterns, but you see them faster. The cycle of breaking and rebuilding continues, but your awareness of it deepens. She sat there and asked herself the question she'd learned to ask, "What is this protecting me from?" And the answer came immediately. From being ordinary, from not mattering, from disappearing if I stop achieving. That terror of ordinariness, of insignificance, it wasn't gone. It never goes away completely, but now she could see it, and seeing it gave her choice. She didn't quit her job that night. She didn't make some dramatic gesture. She just went home, kissed her husband, and the next morning she did something revolutionary. She asked for help. She told her executive team, "I'm falling back into old patterns. I need you to hold me accountable. I need us to build systems that prevent me from overworking, even when I want to." She made her shadow visible to others. She stopped trying to manage it alone. And that is the work of a mature, individuating consciousness. Jung used the word opus, the alchemical great work, to describe individuation. And alchemy is the perfect metaphor because alchemists didn't just transform lead into gold once. They performed the process again and again, each time refining their understanding, each time going deeper into the mystery. You're being trained as an alchemist of your own soul. Every breaking you experience, every time the mask shatters, every time you confront a new layer of shadow, every time you're humbled by your own unconsciousness, that's not failure. That's the work. That's the opus. And here's what makes this bearable. You get better at it. Not in the sense that it hurts less. Sometimes it hurts more because you're more conscious of what you're losing. But you recognize the pattern faster. You trust the process more. You know that what feels like death is actually transformation. David described it like this: "The first time my life fell apart, I thought it was the end of the world. The second time, I thought it was a terrible mistake. The third time, I started to wonder if there was a pattern. And now, when I feel that familiar ground shifting beneath me, I know. Something in me is ready to die so something larger can be born. And I've learned to say yes to it." That's maturity. Not avoiding the breaking, not transcending the need for transformation, but developing the courage and the wisdom to cooperate with your own becoming. There's something else that happens at this stage, something Jung called the mentor archetype. As you individuate, as you spiral deeper into consciousness, you'll find guides, not gurus, not people who have all the answers, but people who've walked this path before you, people who've been broken open and reassembled, people who know the territory of the unconscious because they've traveled it themselves. These mentors appear in different forms. Sometimes they're actual people, a therapist, a teacher, an elder who recognizes something in you and decides to invest. Sometimes they're books that find you at the exact right moment. Sometimes they're dreams, where figures emerge who seem to know more than you do, who guide you through symbolic landscapes, who show you what you're not ready to see consciously. David found his mentor in an unexpected place, a hospice chaplain he met at his father's bedside. The chaplain, a man named Robert, who was 73 and had the kind of weathered peace that only comes from decades of sitting with death, recognized something in David's intensity, the way he was gripping the arms of the chair, the way he couldn't stop talking about his dad's unfinished business. One afternoon, Robert said simply, "You're carrying something that isn't yours to carry." David bristled. "He's my father. It's my responsibility." "No," Robert said, with a gentleness that made it impossible to take offense. "Your responsibility is to be his son, not his savior. You can't do his dying for him. You can only do your own living." That sentence cracked something open in David, and over the next few weeks, as his father slowly let go, Robert taught him about sacred space in a different way, not the space David built for others, which was still subtly about control, but the space of simply being present, of witnessing without fixing, of loving without requiring anything to change. Robert had walked the path of individuation in his own way. He'd been a corporate lawyer who burned out at 45, spent 5 years in what he called the great unraveling, and emerged as someone who could sit with dying people and somehow make them less afraid. He didn't tell David what to do. He just lived in a way that showed what was possible. That's what mentors do. They embody the integration you're reaching toward. They prove it's survivable, and they can see your blind spots, the places where you're still deceiving yourself, still clinging to old identities, because they recognize the pattern. They've worn those same masks. Sarah found her mentor in a CEO she'd always admired from a distance, a woman named Elena who'd built 3 successful companies and then, shockingly, stepped down from the third at its peak to pursue consciousness, as she put it. Sarah had always thought that was bizarre. Who walks away from that kind of success? Until she found herself compulsively rebuilding the achiever. She reached out to Elena, nervously, not sure what she was asking for. They met for coffee. Sarah explained her situation. "I did all this work on myself. I thought I'd changed, but I'm right back where I started." Elena smiled, not unkindly, but with recognition. "Of course you are. You thought individuation was a destination. It's not. It's a spiral, and each time you circle back to the same pattern, you're at a higher altitude. You're conscious of it now. That's the difference." "So how do I stop it?" Sarah asked. "You don't," Elena said. "You stop trying to stop it. You learn to work with your patterns instead of against them. The achiever in you, she's not the enemy. She's the part of you that knows how to materialize things, how to bring visions into form. But she needs to serve something larger than herself. Right now she's serving your ego, your terror of ordinariness. But what if she served yourself? What if all that energy and drive was channeled towards something that actually matters? That conversation changed Sarah's relationship with her ambition. She stopped trying to kill the achiever and started asking, "What do you want to build that would serve more than just me?" The answer came 6 months later. She left her corporate role to build a foundation that taught conscious leadership to emerging entrepreneurs. Same drive, different direction, The achiever was still there, but now she was in service to something beyond ego. That's what mentors help you see. Not how to eliminate your patterns, but how to transform them, how to take the very thing that's been your prison and make it your gift. Jung wrote, "Knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people." Read that again. This is why the work of individuation matters beyond yourself. This is why confronting your shadow, breaking your masks, integrating your unconscious, it's not self-indulgent, it's not narcissistic, it's necessary. Because the more conscious you become of your own patterns, the more you can see them in others without judgment. When you've sat with your own rage, you don't demonize anger in others. When you've faced your own cowardice, you don't despise weakness. When you've integrated your own hunger for power, you don't project evil onto those who seek it. You recognize them because you've been them. This doesn't mean you accept harmful behavior. It doesn't mean you become passive in the face of injustice. But your response comes from a different place. Not from superior righteousness, which is always the shadow speaking, but from compassionate clarity. You can see the person and the pattern. You can oppose the behavior without demonizing the being. David noticed this in his work. After he'd spent years integrating his own trauma, his own rage, his own need for control, people started coming to him, not for advice exactly, but for presence. Other men who were going through their own breakings, divorces, bankruptcies, health crises, found their way to him, and he discovered he could sit with their darkness without needing to fix it, without needing them to be different, because he'd learned to do that with himself. He wasn't a therapist. He didn't pretend to be, but he'd become something equally valuable, a witness who could hold space for another man's unraveling without flinching. Because he'd been there, because he knew that what looks like death is sometimes the only way to life. That's the wounded healer archetype, which we'll explore more deeply in the next chapter. But notice how it emerges naturally from individuation. You don't try to become a healer. You just do your own work so thoroughly that you become capable of recognizing that work in others. Let me be very clear about something, though, and this is important. Higher doesn't mean easier. There's a fantasy that once you reach a certain level of consciousness, life becomes smooth. That once you've individuated enough, you transcend suffering. That integration means you float above the messy realities of human existence in some kind of permanent zen. That is ego talking. That is the fantasy of escape. Jung was explicit about this. There is no coming to consciousness without pain. Not just on the way to consciousness, in consciousness itself. Because the more aware you become, the more you see. The more you see, the more you feel. And the more you feel, the more you're asked to hold. Conscious suffering is different from unconscious suffering. It has meaning, it has purpose, it transforms you, but it's still suffering. The difference is you're no longer a victim of it. You're a participant in it. You're choosing it in service of something greater than comfort. David's life didn't become easier after his transformation. In many ways, it became harder. He could no longer numb out. He could no longer pretend he didn't see the pain around him. He could no longer hide behind action and productivity. He had to feel everything. And sometimes that was excruciating, but he wouldn't go back. Because even though the pain was more intense, it was his pain, not inherited pain, not projected pain, not unconscious, meaningless suffering, but the real lived experience of being fully human. Sarah said something similar. I used to think success meant not having problems. Now I realize consciousness means having the right problems, the problems that actually matter, the problems that make me grow. That's maturity. Not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of meaning. So where are you on this spiral? Pause here. Really, I'm asking you to stop and take inventory. Have you differentiated from the collective yet? Do you know which values are genuinely yours versus which ones you absorbed from your family, your culture, your generation? Or are you still living the script that was written for you before you had a choice? Have you met your shadow? Have you taken back the projections you've been casting onto others? Have you acknowledged the anger, the fear, the shame, the desire that you've been keeping in the basement? Or are you still convinced that your darkness lives out there in other people? Have you encountered your anima or animus? Have you integrated the opposite principle within yourself? Or are you still polarized, still identifying completely with one side of your psyche while projecting the other onto partners or fantasies? And have you sensed, even briefly, the presence of the self? That organizing center that's larger than your personality, deeper than your conditioning, more ancient than your personal history? Or does the idea of something beyond your ego still feel threatening? Comment below. Not to perform your answer, but to actually articulate where you are. Because naming your location on the spiral is itself an act of consciousness. It's the first step toward the next breaking. Here's what Jung discovered through his own individuation. The process accelerates, not because it gets easier, but because you get clearer. You learn to recognize the signs that transformation is coming. You learn to cooperate with it instead of resisting it. The first breaking takes years because you don't know what's happening. You think your life is falling apart randomly. You think you're uniquely cursed. You fight every stage of the dissolution. The second breaking takes less time because somewhere in you, there's a faint recognition. I've been here before. This feels familiar. By the third breaking, you might even see it coming. You notice the restlessness before the crisis, the feeling of outgrowing your current container, the sense that something in you is ready to die. And instead of waiting for external circumstances to force the issue, you might even initiate it. You might consciously choose to let go of what's no longer serving you before life tears it away. That's not mastery, that's participation. You're working with your individuation instead of being dragged through it kicking and screaming. Sarah's third breaking, the one where she realized she'd rebuilt a spiritual persona, was different from her first. She caught it in months instead of years. She saw the pattern while it was still forming, and she had the tools to work with it, the mentors to call, the practices to lean into, the self-honesty to cut through her own rationalizations. She told Elena, "I'm scared I'll keep doing this forever, building a mask, breaking it down, building a new one. Is there ever a point where you're just yourself?" Elena laughed. "Yes and no. You're always yourself. You can't be anything else." But the self isn't static. It's dynamic. It's always unfolding. The goal isn't to arrive at some fixed identity and defend it. The goal is to become so fluid that you can dance with your own becoming. So when you notice yourself calcifying into a new persona, you can catch it early and shed it before it becomes a prison. "So I'll be doing this for the rest of my life." "If you're lucky," Elena said. "Most people build one mask in their 20s and wear it until they die. You're learning to live without masks. That's the real work. And yes, it's lifelong, but it's also the most interesting life possible. This is what I want you to understand. Individuation is not a burden. It's a privilege. You could live your entire life unconscious. Billions of people do. You could wear your persona until it's indistinguishable from your face. You could project your shadow onto enemies and never reclaim it. You could die without ever meeting yourself. But you won't, because you're here. Because something in you has been activated. Because you've tasted consciousness and there's no going back to sleep. Not completely, not permanently. Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." Privilege, not punishment, not obligation. Privilege. You're being given the opportunity to participate consciously in your own evolution, to be a sculptor of your soul instead of a passenger in your life, to transform suffering into meaning, to alchemize your wounds into wisdom, to become slowly and painfully and beautifully whole. This is the work, not for a year, not until you've fixed yourself, but for the rest of your life. And here's the secret that makes it bearable. You're not doing it alone. There's an invisible community of individuating beings throughout time. Every person who's ever asked, "Who am I, really?" is part of your lineage. Every person who's broken open and been willing to integrate their shadow is walking beside you, even if you never meet them. Jung is with you. Your mentors, known and unknown, are with you, and the self, that mysterious center, is guiding you through dreams and symptoms and synchronicities toward wholeness. You're not lost. You're exactly where you need to be. And the next breaking, when it comes, and it will come, you'll recognize it faster. You'll trust it more deeply. You'll know that what feels like an ending is always, always a beginning. In the next chapter, we're going to expand from your individual journey to the collective dimension, because here's what Jung knew, that changes everything. Your personal transformation isn't just about you. When you do this work, when you integrate your shadow, when you individuate, when you become conscious, you're not just healing yourself. You're healing patterns that have been repeating through generations. You're serving something much larger than your personal growth. Your breaking serves the collective unconscious, and that changes everything about why you're here. What if I told you that the breakdown you went through, the one you thought was destroying your life, was actually answering a call you didn't even know you'd sent? What if your personal crisis wasn't personal at all, but a response to something vast, ancient, and collective, asking to be healed through you? This is where Jung's work becomes truly revolutionary. This is where we move from the individual psyche to something that connects us all. Something deeper than culture, older than history, more fundamental than language. Jung called it the collective unconscious, and understanding it changes everything about who you think you are and why you're here. Most of us live with an unspoken assumption that we're separate, that my mind is mine, your mind is yours, and while we influence each other, we're ultimately distinct, isolated units of consciousness. This is the modern view, the rational view, the scientific view, at least as it's popularly understood. But Jung discovered something that ancient cultures have always known. There's a layer of psyche that belongs to no one individually, but to all of us collectively. A vast reservoir of patterns, images, and potentials that every human being inherits simply by being human. It's not genetic in the biological sense, though it may be transmitted through biological structures. It's not learned, though culture shapes how it expresses. It's deeper than both. It's the psychological equivalent of instinct, the architecture of human experience itself. Jung wrote, "The collective unconscious contains the whole spiritual heritage of mankind's evolution, born anew in the brain structure of every individual." Read that again. Born anew in the brain structure of every individual. You didn't just inherit your mother's eyes and your father's temperament. You inherited the entire psychological history of humanity, the archetypes, the symbols, the myths, the patterns of transformation that human beings have been enacting for millennia. And here's the critical part. Those patterns don't just live in you passively. They're active. They're trying to express. They're seeking consciousness. And when they can't find expression in the collective, when a culture becomes too rigid, too defended, too unconscious, they'll erupt through individuals. That's what your breaking was. Not punishment, not random, not even primarily about your personal history. Your breaking was the collective unconscious, using you as a portal for something that needed to be brought into consciousness. Let me show you how this works. Think about David. His story, on the surface, is completely personal. Childhood trauma, abusive father, desperate need to build and protect, the collapse of his construction company, the spiral into workaholism and isolation. But look closer. Look at the pattern. David's father was a builder who destroyed what he built: houses, businesses, relationships. He created and crushed in the same motion. That's not just one man's psychology. That's a pattern. The destructive masculine, the patriarch who rules through violence, the builder who becomes the tyrant. David inherited this pattern, not just psychologically, but archetypally. He was carrying a version of the wounded king, the destructive father that goes back through generations. His own father was enacting it. His grandfather probably was too. How far back does it go? How many men in his lineage have been trapped in this same loop of building and destroying, creating and controlling? When David's company collapsed, when his life broke open, he wasn't just healing his relationship with his father. He was healing the pattern itself. He was bringing consciousness to something that had been unconscious through his entire lineage. And here's the profound part. When he did that, the pattern stopped. Not just in him, though it did stop in him, but in the invisible web of connection that linked him to everyone carrying that same wound. You can't see this happen. There's no measurable proof, but you can feel it. Ask anyone who's done deep healing work on ancestral patterns, and they'll tell you something shifts, not just in their own life, but in their family system. Parents soften, siblings change. Even family members who know nothing about the work start acting differently. Why? Because consciousness moves through systems. Because healing isn't just individual, it's relational, familial, collective. Jung said, the unconscious of one person communicates with that of another, forming a direct link which is independent of consciousness. Your healing heals more than you. This brings us to one of Jung's most powerful concepts, the wounded healer. In Greek mythology, there's a centaur named Chiron, half man, half horse. He was the wisest of all centaurs, a teacher of heroes, but he carried an unhealable wound, struck by a poisoned arrow, suffering perpetually, unable to die because he was immortal. From this wound came his gift. Because Chiron suffered, he understood suffering. Because he couldn't heal himself, he learned to heal others. His wound became his medicine. Jung recognized this as an archetype, a universal pattern that appears in every culture. The shaman who becomes a healer after surviving a life-threatening illness. The therapist whose own breakdown taught them to guide others. The teacher whose wound became their wisdom. You are this archetype. Your specific breaking, the exact shape of your suffering, the particular way you've been dismantled. That's not random. That's your medicine. That's the unique gift you're being prepared to offer the world. David didn't know this at first. He thought his healing was just about him, about finally becoming functional, stable, less broken. But 3 years into his recovery, something started happening. Men began showing up in his life, not intentionally, not through any effort on his part. They just appeared. A neighbor who'd just gone through a divorce and was sleeping in his truck. A young guy from the hardware store who mentioned, casually, that his dad never loved him. A contractor David hired who broke down in tears during a lunch break, talking about his son who wouldn't speak to him. David didn't advertise himself as a healer. He didn't have a practice or a methodology, but something in him, his presence, his groundedness, the way he could listen without judgment, drew wounded men to him because he'd been there, because he knew the territory of that specific darkness. He started inviting them to his shop, not therapy, not even advice, really, just space, sacred space like he'd learned to build. A place where men could sit without performing, could speak without being fixed, could cry without being shamed. He called it nothing. It had no name. But within 2 years, there were 15 men who showed up every Thursday night, sitting on overturned buckets and sawhorses, drinking beer, talking about what it means to be a man when you've been broken by masculinity. Working with their hands, building something simple, a table or a bench, while working through their pain. One night, one of the men said, "You know what this is, right? You're doing what someone should have done for your father. You're creating the space he never had. And in doing that, you're healing not just us. You're healing him. You're healing the whole line of men who never learned how to do this." David sat with that, and he realized his wound, the absent father, the violent masculinity, the desperate need for safe space, that wound had become his medicine, not despite the pain, but because of it. That's the wounded healer. Your breakdown wasn't destroying you. It was initiating you, preparing you to hold space for others, walking through the same fire. Sarah's story follows a similar pattern, though it looked completely different. Her wound was perfectionism, the compulsive need to achieve, to prove, to perform, the terror of being ordinary, the belief that her worth depended on her output. After her breakdown, after she did the work of integrating her shadow and learning to rest, she thought she was done. She thought she'd healed her wound and could move on. But the wound kept calling her back, not to repeat the pattern, but to serve it. She kept meeting women, high-achieving, burnout-prone, terrified of failure women who looked at her like she had something they needed. And she did. Not a formula, not a 5-step system, just proof that you could survive the death of your identity as an achiever and find something more real on the other side. So she started teaching, not formally at first, just coffee conversations, mentoring calls. But women kept asking, "How did you do it? How did you stop? How did you learn to value yourself outside of what you produce?" And Sarah realized her wound, the achiever, the perfection machine, the compulsive productivity, that was her medicine. Because she'd lived it so thoroughly, she could see it in others before they could see it in themselves. She could name it without judgment. She could hold space for the terror that comes when you stop performing. 3 years later, she was running workshops for female executives, not teaching them to be better leaders. There are a million people doing that. Teaching them to survive the death of leadership as identity, teaching them what happens after the mask breaks. One woman said to her, "You're not teaching us success. You're teaching us how to fail consciously. And somehow that's more valuable than anything I learned in business school." That's exactly right, because Sarah's medicine wasn't about achievement. It was about the conscious relationship with achievement, the ability to see the pattern while you're in it, the courage to choose differently even when the old programming is screaming. And here's what Sarah discovered. Every woman she taught, every person she helped wake up from the trance of compulsive productivity, that wasn't just helping them, it was healing the pattern itself. The collective pattern of women proving their worth through exhaustion. The inherited belief that rest equals laziness. The centuries of conditioning that said, "You're only valuable if you're useful." By healing her relationship to achievement, she was healing that wound in the collective. And every woman who did the same work amplified that healing. This is what Jung meant when he said, "As far as we can discern, the sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being." Your consciousness matters, not just to you, to the whole. Let me get specific about how this works, because it sounds mystical and vague until you understand the mechanism. The collective unconscious isn't some separate realm floating above reality. It's not metaphysical in the sense of being disconnected from the material world. It's the substrate of culture, relationship, and individual psychology. It's the water we're all swimming in without knowing we're wet. When you carry an unconscious pattern, let's say the pattern of the wounded masculine or the compulsive achiever, you don't just suffer it personally, you transmit it. Through your relationships, through your parenting, through every interaction you have. David, before his breaking, was transmitting the destructive masculine to everyone around him. His wife felt controlled. His employees felt like they had to walk on eggshells. His friends stopped calling because being around him was exhausting. He wasn't trying to hurt anyone, but the pattern was living through him, unconsciously, and it infected every system he touched. When he brought that pattern into consciousness, when he did the work of integration, he stopped transmitting it. Or more accurately, he transformed it. The masculine energy didn't disappear. It became conscious. It became generative instead of destructive. And everyone around him felt the shift. His wife said, "It's like you became solid in a different way. You were always strong, but it was brittle strength. Now you're strong like a tree, rooted, flexible, alive." That shift isn't just psychological. It's systemic. Because every person who stops transmitting a destructive pattern makes space for a new pattern to emerge. And that space ripples outward. This is why Jung said, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." You're not a closed system. You're porous. You're constantly exchanging psychic material with everyone you encounter. And when you transform your relationship to the unconscious, when you make the unconscious conscious, you change the field for everyone. Sarah noticed this in her work. She'd have a woman in her workshop who would break through on something, finally seeing the pattern of perfectionism, finally letting herself cry about the impossible standards she'd been living under. And within days, sometimes hours, other women in her life would reach out. Her sister would call. Her daughter would open up about something she'd been hiding. Her colleagues would suddenly start talking about burnout. Why? Because the pattern she'd been holding unconsciously was now conscious, and that consciousness created permission for others to see it too. This is the mechanism of collective healing. It's not magic, it's resonance, it's systems theory. It's the understanding that consciousness is contagious. When you heal, you create a field of permission for others to heal. Let's go deeper. Let's talk about ancestral patterns. This is where Jung's work intersects with traditions that have always known what Western psychology is just rediscovering. Your psyche doesn't begin with your birth. It's inherited. Not just the content, your mother's fears, your father's rage, but the structure, the patterns. Jung observed this through his work with patients. He'd have people dream images they had no personal reason to know. Ancient symbols, mythological figures, religious motifs from cultures they'd never studied. Where was this material coming from? Not from their personal unconscious, their individual life experience. It was coming from deeper, from the collective unconscious, the shared reservoir of human psychological experience. But there's an intermediate layer that Jung also recognized, the family unconscious. The specific patterns carried through your lineage, the unresolved traumas, the unspoken shames, the abandoned dreams, David's violence toward himself, the way he drove himself past exhaustion, the way he punished his body through work that didn't start with him. His father did the same thing. His grandfather, from what little David knew, died of a heart attack at 52 while working double shifts. 3 generations of men destroying themselves through labor. Why? What were they working to prove? What were they running from? David will never know the full story, but he knows this. When he stopped the pattern in himself, something shifted in the lineage. His younger brother, who he barely spoke to, suddenly called him, started asking questions about therapy, started admitting that maybe he was drinking too much, working too much, avoiding his family too much. David didn't preach to him, didn't try to fix him, just said, "Yeah, I was there too. It almost killed me. If you want to talk about it, I'm here." That's all it took, because the pattern was looking for consciousness. And when it found consciousness in David, it could begin to release its grip on the whole family system. Sarah experienced something similar. Her mother had been a perfectionist. Her grandmother had been the same. 3 generations of women performing excellence to earn basic human dignity. 3 generations of women who couldn't rest because rest meant worthlessness. When Sarah finally broke that pattern, when she chose rest, chose ordinariness, chose being overachieving, her mother noticed. At first, she was critical. "You're wasting your potential. You used to be so driven." But underneath the criticism, Sarah could hear something else: fear. Her mother was terrified that if Sarah stopped achieving, she'd disappear, because that's what her mother believed about herself. Sarah didn't argue, she just lived differently, and slowly, over 2 years, her mother started asking questions, small ones at first. How do you deal with the anxiety of not doing enough? Then bigger ones. Do you think I wasted my life? That question broke Sarah's heart, because her mother hadn't wasted her life. She'd just spent it proving something that didn't need to be proven. And now, at 70, she was finally asking if there was another way. Sarah couldn't give her mother those years back, but she could show her that it wasn't too late. That even now, even at 70, you could learn to rest. You could learn that your worth isn't conditional. Her mother started painting, something she'd loved as a girl but abandoned because it wasn't practical. She'd show Sarah her paintings, nervously, like a child seeking approval, and Sarah would say, "They're beautiful, not because they're good, because they're yours." That's ancestral healing, not erasing the past, but releasing its grip on the future. This brings us to the question everyone wants to know. How do you actually do this? How do you heal ancestral patterns? How do you work with the collective unconscious? The answer is both simple and demanding. You heal yourself, not in a self-absorbed way, not in a way that ignores relationship or responsibility, but you do your own work so thoroughly that the pattern can't use you anymore. You bring consciousness to what was unconscious. You integrate what was split. You name what was nameless. And in doing that, you transform the pattern not just for yourself, but for everyone connected to it. Jung gave us practices for this, not techniques exactly, but orientations, ways of engaging with the unconscious that allow transformation to happen. First, pay attention to your dreams. The unconscious speaks in images, symbols, narratives. Your dreams are messages from the collective, trying to become conscious through you. Write them down. Notice recurring themes. Ask, what is trying to emerge here? David kept a dream journal for 5 years. At first, his dreams were violent, full of rage and destruction. His father appeared as a tyrant, a monster, a force of pure violence. But over time, as David integrated his shadow, the dreams changed. His father became smaller, less demonic, more human. And eventually, David dreamed of his father as a child, scared, alone, trying to build walls to protect himself. That dream changed everything, because David saw his father wasn't evil, his father was terrified, and that terror had calcified into violence, and that violence had been passed down. In the dream, David held his father as a child, just held him, let him cry, and when David woke up, something had shifted. The rage was gone, not repressed, transformed. He could see his father with compassion now, not excusing the violence, but understanding its source. That's ancestral healing through dream work. The unconscious showed David what consciousness needed to see. Second, notice your projections. What you see in others is always, at least partially, about you. When you find yourself intensely triggered by someone, fascinated or repelled, ask yourself, what part of me am I seeing in them? Sarah's breakthrough came when she realized she was obsessed with criticizing Instagram influencers who performed their perfect lives online. She'd spend hours hate scrolling, collecting evidence of their fakeness, their narcissism, their shallow performance. Her therapist finally asked, "Why does this bother you so much?" And Sarah heard herself say, "Because they're doing what I used to do. They're performing. They're exhausting themselves for likes. They're destroying themselves for validation, and they don't even know it. Pause. Silence. You're not angry at them, her therapist said. You're angry at yourself, at the part of you that did that for 20 years. Sarah cried, not sad crying, relieved crying, because she'd been projecting her own unintegrated shadow onto these strangers online. The part of her that still, secretly, wanted to perform. The part that was ashamed of how long she'd lived that way. Once she saw the projection, she could take it back. And immediately, her obsession with influencers disappeared. She could scroll past without reaction, because it was no longer about them. It had never been about them. That's shadow work through projection. When you reclaim what you've cast onto others, you heal the split in yourself, and you stop adding your unconsciousness to the collective field. Third, engage with archetypes consciously. The collective unconscious speaks through archetypal patterns. The hero, the mother, the trickster, the wise old man, the shadow. You're not creating these patterns, they're already there, universal and ancient, but you can choose which ones you're serving. David recognized he was enacting the warrior archetype, but in its destructive form. The warrior who fights everything, who sees every situation as combat, who can never rest because rest is surrender. Through his work, he learned to transform that into the conscious warrior. The protector, not the aggressor. The builder of boundaries, not walls. The man who can be fierce when necessary, but knows the difference between strength and violence. That transformation didn't happen through thinking about it. It happened through embodied practice. Martial arts, where he learned that real strength is controlled. Meditation, where he learned that stillness isn't weakness. Mentorship, where he learned that vulnerability is courage. The archetype didn't disappear, it transformed. And in transforming it in himself, he offered a different model to every man who encountered him. Now here's where this gets profound, and why Jung devoted his life to this work. When you do this, when you heal your personal wound, transform your ancestral patterns, and bring consciousness to the archetypes living through you, you're not just changing yourself. You're participating in the evolution of human consciousness. Jung believed that consciousness itself is evolution becoming aware of itself, that the universe is waking up through human awareness, and every time an individual makes the unconscious conscious, they're adding to the collective light. He wrote, "As far as we can discern, the sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being." Think about what that means. Your life, your specific, ordinary, messy life, has cosmic significance, not because you're special, but because you're conscious, or learning to be. Every moment you choose awareness over reactivity, you're serving the evolution of consciousness. Every time you integrate rather than project, you're healing the collective. Every time you transform your wound into medicine, you're offering something to the whole that wouldn't exist without you. This is why your breaking matters. This is why your suffering isn't meaningless. This is why you can't just get over it and move on. You're being asked to serve something larger than your personal comfort. You're being recruited into the sacred work of bringing light to darkness, not someone else's darkness, not evil out there in the world, the darkness of unconsciousness itself. And here's the beautiful, humbling truth. You don't have to be perfect to do this. You don't have to be enlightened. You don't have to have your shit completely together. You just have to be willing to see, willing to integrate, willing to transform. That's enough. That's always been enough. David sits in his workshop most Thursday nights now with his circle of men. They're building a table tonight. Oak, simple, solid. They work in silence mostly, but occasionally someone speaks. Tonight, it's Marcus, a 50-year-old accountant whose wife just left him. He's sanding a table leg, tears running down his face, not even trying to hide them. "I don't know how to be a person," he says. "I know how to be a provider, I know how to be responsible, but just a person? Someone who feels things? I don't know how to do that." The other men nod. They know. David doesn't offer advice, doesn't try to fix it, just says, "Yeah, I didn't either. I'm still learning." That's the medicine. Not having the answers, but having walked the path, having survived the breaking, having found some ground on the other side. Marcus keeps sanding, and somehow that table they're building together becomes sacred. Not because it's perfect, because it's made by broken men learning to be whole. That's the work. That's the healing. That's how the collective unconscious transforms. One person, one wound, one table at a time. Sarah stands in front of 60 female executives at her workshop. She's about to say something she's never said publicly before. Something vulnerable. Something true. "I built my entire identity on being exceptional," she begins. "And when that identity shattered, I wanted to die. Not metaphorically, actually die. Because I genuinely believed that if I wasn't exceptional, I didn't deserve to exist." The room is silent, uncomfortable. Some women are crying. And here's what I learned. That belief didn't come from me. It came through me. It's a collective pattern. Generations of women who've been told, explicitly or implicitly, that their worth is conditional, that they have to earn their right to take up space, that rest is selfish, that boundaries are bitchy, that ambition is unfeminine, but so is mediocrity. She pauses. We're all carrying this, and we're all transmitting it to our daughters, our employees, every woman we encounter, until we heal it in ourselves. A woman in the front row raises her hand. "How? How do you heal something that big?" Sarah smiles. "You don't. Not all at once. You heal your version of it, your specific relationship to worth and achievement and rest. And in healing yours, you make it possible for others to heal theirs. It's not about fixing the whole collective. It's about transforming your piece of it and trusting that consciousness spreads." Another woman. "But what if we fail? What if we can't break the pattern?" "Then you fail consciously," Sarah says. "You name it. You see it. You choose to work with it again tomorrow. The pattern doesn't expect perfection. That's the old paradigm talking. The pattern just wants consciousness. It wants to be seen. And every time you see it, even if you can't change it in that moment, you're weakening its hold." That's the teaching. That's the medicine. That's how the collective heals, through individual women willing to see the pattern and stop transmitting it unconsciously. So what pattern are you carrying? What wound did you inherit that's been looking for consciousness through your life? What's the specific shape of your suffering? Not just what happened to you personally, but what's been repeating through your lineage, your culture, your gender, your time. For some of you, it's the pattern David carried, the destructive masculine, the warrior who wars against himself, the builder who can't stop building because stopping means feeling. For some of you, it's the pattern Sarah carried, the conditional worth, the exhausted achiever, the person who believes they're only valuable when they're producing. For some of you, it's something else entirely, the pattern of the abandoned child who becomes the rejecting adult, the pattern of the shamed sexuality that becomes either repression or compulsion, the pattern of the silenced voice that becomes either passive or aggressive. You know what your pattern is. You've been living it. You've been suffering it. And until now, you might have thought it was just yours. But it's not. It's collective. And you're the one it chose to become conscious through. That's not burden. That's calling. The wound you carry is your medicine. Not someday. Not after you've fully healed. Right now. In the midst of your mess. In the middle of your uncertainty. Your consciousness of the pattern is already healing it. Comment below. What pattern do you think you've inherited? What's the collective wound that's been trying to become conscious through your life? Don't perform the answer. Don't make it sound spiritual. Just name it as plainly as you can, because naming it is the first act of healing, and your naming might be the permission someone else needs to see their own pattern. Jung spent his last years at his tower in Bollingen, a stone structure he built with his own hands on the shore of a lake. He carved symbols into the walls, alchemical images, archetypal figures, messages to the future. One of them said, "Whether I have done it or whether I have not done it, the work that I was meant to do has been done." He knew. He knew that his individual life was in service to something collective, that his personal transformation, his confrontation with the unconscious, his integration of his shadow, his willingness to document the journey, was serving humanity's evolution. He wasn't special, he was willing, and that made all the difference. You are being asked for the same willingness, not to be Jung, not to write the books or develop the theories, but to live the process, to transform your wound into medicine, to heal the pattern that's been waiting for consciousness through you. This is why you're here, not to be comfortable, not to be successful, not even to be happy in the conventional sense. You're here to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being. And every moment you choose consciousness over unconsciousness, you're doing that. You're serving the evolution of humanity. You're healing the collective. That's the real work. That's what the breaking was preparing you for. And in the next chapter, we need to talk about the shadow side of this work, because there's a final trap waiting for everyone who begins to wake up. A trap so subtle, so seductive, that it catches even the most sincere seekers. It's the trap of spiritual superiority, the ego's final disguise, the way your transformation can become your new prison. We need to talk about the shadow of enlightenment. Let me tell you about the most dangerous moment in your transformation. It's not the breaking. It's not the confrontation with your shadow. It's not the dark night when you're not sure you'll survive. It's the moment after, when you start to feel better, when the work is paying off, when you notice you're different from how you used to be, more conscious, more integrated, more aware. That's when the ego makes its final move. Because here's what happens. You've done real work. You've confronted your shadow. You've broken your masks. You've integrated parts of yourself that were split off. And you can feel it. You're operating from a different place. You're less reactive, more grounded. You have language for what's happening in your psyche. You can see patterns in yourself and others. And then, quietly, almost imperceptibly, a thought forms. I'm not like other people anymore. And with that thought, a new mask begins to form. A more sophisticated mask, a spiritual mask. The mask of the awakened one, the conscious one, the person who's done the work. And unless you catch it, that mask will become more tyrannical than any of the others, because this time, you've built it out of your actual growth. This is the shadow of enlightenment, and it's the final test of whether you've genuinely individuated or just rearranged your ego. Jung warned about this, explicitly, repeatedly. He called it inflation, the state where the ego identifies with the self, where you mistake your temporary glimpse of consciousness for permanent enlightenment. He wrote, "Beware of unearned wisdom." Unearned wisdom. Think about that phrase. Wisdom you haven't fully integrated, insight you've experienced but not embodied, understanding that lives in your head but not in your life. You can glimpse the truth of individuation. You can intellectually understand shadow work. You can even have moments of genuine integration. But if you claim those insights before you've fully lived them, before they've been tested by time and difficulty, you're building another persona, this time a spiritual one. And here's why this is so dangerous. The spiritual persona is harder to detect than any other mask, because it's built from real material. You're not lying when you say you've confronted your shadow. You're not faking when you talk about integration. You really have experienced something true. But the ego is brilliant, it's adaptive, and it will take your genuine growth and weaponize it. It will turn your transformation into a new identity, and that identity will be harder to break than the old one, because this time you'll defend it with spiritual language. I'm not being defensive, I'm setting boundaries. I'm not judging you, I'm discerning energy. I'm not avoiding my shadow, I'm protecting my peace. See how it works? The vocabulary of consciousness becomes the disguise for unconsciousness. Let me show you what this looked like in Sarah's life, because her temptation towards spiritual bypassing was subtle and seductive. After her breakdown, after she'd done the work of integrating her achiever and learning to rest, Sarah felt genuinely transformed, and she was. She'd broken a pattern that had controlled her for decades. She could finally breathe. But then, about 2 years into her recovery, something started happening. She began receiving invitations to speak at conferences, on podcasts, to corporate groups who wanted to learn about conscious leadership and authentic success. At first, she declined. She didn't feel ready, but the invitations kept coming, and people were genuinely helped by her story. Women would email her saying, "You changed my life. I finally gave myself permission to rest." That feedback felt good, really good. And slowly, almost without noticing, Sarah started building a new identity around it. She became the recovered workaholic, the conscious leader, the woman who'd broken free from the achievement trap. She updated her LinkedIn bio, started using hashtags like NAS Authentic Leadership and Our Conscious Entrepreneur, began positioning herself as someone who'd transcended what others were still trapped in. She wasn't lying, she had done the work, but she was starting to use that work as a new form of superiority. She'd be in meetings with other executives and catch herself thinking, "They're so unconscious, still chasing achievement, still performing. I used to be like that, but I'm awake now." That thought, "I'm awake now," that was the red flag, because the moment you think you're awake, you've fallen back asleep. The moment you think you've arrived, you've started regressing. It showed up in subtle ways. She'd interrupt people with, "Actually, what you're describing is shadow projection," and then explain Jung to them. She'd suggest books about consciousness with a tone that implied, "When you've read what I've read, you'll understand." She started using meditation and therapy as credentials, as proof that she was further along than others. Her husband noticed it first. One night, after she'd spent 20 minutes explaining to his sister why her relationship problems were clearly unintegrated shadow material, he said quietly, "You're doing it again." "Doing what?" Sarah snapped, immediately defensive. "Building a mask. It's a different mask." "But it's still a mask." Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to explain that no, this was different, this was real. She'd actually done the work, but something stopped her. A familiar feeling, the same tightness she'd felt before her first breaking, the same rigidity, the same need to be right. She sat with it, asked herself the question she'd learned to ask, "What am I protecting?" And the answer came immediately. "I'm protecting my identity as someone who's done the work, because if I'm not that, then who am I?" There it was, the old pattern, the same pattern, different costume. She'd rebuilt the achiever. This time she was achieving consciousness, collecting spiritual credentials, performing awakening. And it was just as exhausting, just as inauthentic as the corporate persona had been. This is what Jung called inflation, and it's incredibly common among people who do transformational work. You confront your shadow, you start seeing shadow everywhere. You become the shadow detective, pointing out everyone else's unconsciousness while missing your own. You learn about trauma. Suddenly, everyone who disagrees with you is triggered or hasn't done their healing work. You experience a spiritual awakening. Now you're the awakened one, surrounded by the sleeping masses. The ego doesn't die. It just learns the language of its own death and uses that language to rebuild itself. Jung described it like this: the danger is that one may become identical with the collective psyche, and this involves a dissolution and extinction of one's individual consciousness, a state of godlikeness or of absorption in the unconscious. Translation: you start identifying with the archetype instead of relating to it. You don't think, I'm learning about the wise old man archetype. You think, I am the wise one. You don't think, I'm working with my shadow. You think, I've transcended my shadow. That identification, that's inflation. And it's the ego's most sophisticated defense. Because now it doesn't just resist transformation. It claims transformation while remaining fundamentally unchanged. There are specific signs of spiritual bypassing. Jung didn't use that term. That came later from John Wellwood, but he understood the phenomenon intimately. Sign 1. You use spiritual language to avoid emotional reality. I don't feel anger, I just notice the energy and choose peace. Translation: I'm repressing my anger and calling it enlightenment. I'm releasing attachment to the outcome. Translation: I'm terrified I'll fail, so I'm pretending I don't care. Everything happens for a reason. Translation: I'm avoiding the reality that some things are genuinely tragic and meaningless, and that scares me. Spiritual bypassing sounds wise. It uses the right words, but underneath it's the same avoidance that's always been there. You're just using consciousness vocabulary to justify unconsciousness. Sign 2. You're more interested in appearing conscious than being conscious. You post about your healing journey on social media. You talk about your therapy sessions at dinner parties. You drop Jung quotes into conversations to demonstrate your depth. None of this means you're not doing real work, but ask yourself, am I sharing this to help others or to position myself? Am I being vulnerable or performing vulnerability? Am I teaching or proving? The difference is subtle. Real vulnerability feels risky. Performed vulnerability feels safe because you're controlling how you're seen. Sign 3. You use your growth to judge others. I used to be unconscious like that, but I've done the work. People who are still chasing success just haven't awakened yet. If they dealt with their shadow, they wouldn't be so reactive. This is the most obvious sign of spiritual bypassing. You're using your consciousness as a weapon. You're creating a new hierarchy where you're superior, not because of wealth or status, but because of awareness. And here's the thing, you might be more aware. You might have genuinely done more work than the person you're judging, but the moment you use that awareness to feel superior, you've lost it. Because true consciousness includes radical equality, the understanding that we're all carrying shadows, we're all works in progress, we're all struggling with the same fundamental patterns. Jung said, knowing your own darkness is the best method for dealing with the darknesses of other people. Not judging, not diagnosing, not fixing, knowing, recognizing your own darkness so completely that you can see it in others without condemnation. Sign 4. You've stopped doing the work while claiming you've done the work. This one's insidious. You go to therapy for 3 years, make real progress, have genuine breakthroughs, and then you stop because you've healed, you've integrated your shadow, you're done. But individuation is lifelong. The shadow doesn't get fully integrated once. New layers emerge, new patterns surface, and if you're not actively engaged with your unconscious anymore, you're regressing, even if you're talking about consciousness all day. Sarah caught herself doing this. She'd stopped seeing her therapist, stopped journaling, stopped doing the practices that had actually created her transformation. She was too busy teaching others about transformation to do her own work. That's bypassing, using the past tense. I've done the work, when growth is always present tense, always ongoing, always requiring engagement. Sign 5. You're addicted to spiritual experiences rather than committed to integration. You chase peak experiences, ayahuasca ceremonies, meditation retreats, breathwork sessions. Each one gives you a glimpse of something beyond ego, and it feels profound. It is profound, but then you come back to regular life and nothing changes. You're still reactive with your partner, still avoidant with your parents, still performing at work, still trapped in the same patterns. Why? Because you're collecting experiences instead of doing the slow, unglamorous work of integration. You want the high of revelation without the discipline of embodiment. Jung was clear about this. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own souls. The irony is that seeking spiritual experiences can itself be avoidance. You're so focused on transcendence that you bypass the ordinary work of being human. Sign 6. You've built a spiritual identity you're now defending. This is the completion of the cycle. You've become the awakened one, the conscious one, the healed one. And now that identity is precious. You need it. You defend it. You feel threatened when someone questions it. Someone calls you out for being judgmental, and you immediately explain why they're wrong, why they misunderstood, why you were actually being compassionate. Someone suggests you might still have work to do, and you list all the work you've already done as evidence. You've rebuilt the ego. This time, it's a spiritual ego. And it's more defended than ever because you've learned to disguise your defenses as boundaries. So, what do you do when you recognize this? When you realize you've built a spiritual persona that you're bypassing instead of integrating, that your transformation has become your new trap. You do what you've always done. You break it, not dramatically, not with self-punishment or shame, but with honesty, with humility, with the willingness to see that you've been deceiving yourself again. Sarah had to face this, and it was harder than her original breaking in some ways, because this time she couldn't blame external circumstances. She'd built this prison herself, out of her genuine growth. She went back to therapy, not to talk about her past, to talk about her present, about how she'd been using consciousness as a new form of achievement, about how the spiritual persona she'd built was just as rigid as the corporate one. Her therapist asked her a devastating question. What would it mean to be ordinary? Sarah couldn't answer, because that was still the terror underneath everything. That without the mask, whether it was the perfect executive or the conscious leader, she was nothing. Ordinary, forgettable, not special. And her therapist said, that's the work now, learning to be ordinary, learning that consciousness doesn't make you special, it just makes you real. That landed, because Sarah realized she'd been using transformation to avoid ordinariness. She'd been collecting spiritual credentials the same way she'd collected corporate ones. Different currency, same compulsion. The work wasn't to become more conscious. The work was to be willing to be ordinary, to be no one, to stop performing her awakening and just live. David went through a version of this too, though it looked different. After a few years of his Thursday night men's circle, David started getting recognition. Local press did a story about him. Man creates healing space for men after his own trauma. Other communities reached out, asking him to help them start similar groups. And David felt something shift in him. Pride, yes, but also something more dangerous. A sense that he'd figured it out, that he knew how to heal men, that he had the answer. He started talking differently in the circle. Less sharing, more teaching. Less vulnerable, more authoritative. He'd interrupt guys to explain what their stories really meant in Jungian terms. He'd assign them homework. He'd created a structure where he was the healer and they were the wounded. One night, one of the guys, Marcus, the accountant who'd been crying while sanding wood, said something that stopped David cold. "You know what I miss? I miss when you didn't have all the answers. when you were just another fucked up guy trying to figure it out. Now you're like a therapist or something, and it's not the same. David's first reaction was defensive. He's just trying to help. He'd learned things that could serve them. What's wrong with sharing that knowledge? But he sat with it, and he realized Marcus was right. David had been using the circle to build a new identity, the wounded healer, the guide. There's a moment that comes to every person who walks this path, a moment so subtle you might miss it entirely. It arrives not with fanfare or revelation, but with a strange, unfamiliar sensation, the sensation of being yourself, completely, without apology, without performance, without the exhausting maintenance of all those carefully constructed versions of who you thought you needed to be. Most people never reach this moment. They die having lived 1,000 partial lives, none of them fully their own. They exit this world still wearing the masks they put on in childhood, still running from shadows they never had the courage to name, still believing they are the persona they've been performing for decades. But you're here because somewhere, somehow, you sensed there was something more, something whole, something real. Today, we're going to talk about what happens when the fragmented pieces finally come together, when the persona stops being your prison, when the shadow stops being your enemy, when the self, the deep, unified center of your being, finally takes its rightful place as the organizing principle of your life. This is Chapter 12. This is what integration actually looks like. Carl Jung once said something that most people misunderstand completely. I'd rather be whole than good. Read that again. Let it disturb you, because what Jung is saying here isn't that morality doesn't matter. It's that the desperate attempt to be only good, to exile everything that doesn't fit your idealized self-image, is what keeps you fragmented, what keeps you performing, what keeps you from ever actually being. Wholeness, true integration, doesn't mean you've transcended your humanity. It doesn't mean you've eliminated your darkness, purified your shadow, or ascended beyond the messy, contradictory, difficult realities of being human. Integration means you've stopped running. You've stopped pretending the shadow doesn't exist. You've stopped believing you're only the persona you present to the world. You've stopped fragmenting yourself into acceptable and unacceptable pieces, then spending all your energy maintaining the illusion that only the acceptable pieces are real. Wholeness means you've learned to hold the contradictions, all of them, consciously, simultaneously, without splitting apart. Let me show you what this looks like. Remember Sarah? The high-achieving perfectionist who spent 3 decades building a flawless professional identity, while her shadow, her rage, her grief, her need grew more powerful in the darkness. 3 years after her breaking, Sarah's life looks very different, but not in the way you might expect. She still runs her consulting firm. She still delivers exceptional work for her clients. She's still successful by any external measure. But something fundamental has changed. The quality of her presence has transformed entirely. She walks into client meetings now without the invisible armor she used to wear. She doesn't need to prove anything anymore. When a client challenges her, she doesn't feel that old spike of defensive rage. Or rather, she feels it, recognizes it, and doesn't become it. She can say, I notice I'm feeling defensive right now. Let me take a breath and really hear what you're saying. This isn't weakness. This is power, real power, the power of someone who knows all of herself and isn't afraid of any of it. Last month, Sarah had to fire someone from her team. The old Sarah would have agonized over it for weeks, then delivered the news with cold, distant professionalism, armor thick, shadow exiled, persona performing the role of the tough executive who makes hard decisions. The integrated Sarah did something different. She acknowledged the difficulty of the conversation from the beginning. She was clear and direct about the business reasons. but she also allowed herself to feel and express genuine sadness about it. "This is hard," she said. "I'm genuinely disappointed it didn't work out differently, and I want to support you through this transition however I can." The person she fired later told a mutual colleague, "It was the most respectful firing I've ever experienced. She didn't pretend it wasn't painful. She treated me like a whole human being, even in that moment." That's what integration looks like. Sarah contained the contradiction. She held both the business necessity and the human compassion. She didn't split herself into cold professional or emotional empath. She was both, simultaneously, consciously. Her relationships have transformed too. She's in a relationship now, something that felt impossible during her persona-dominated years. She chose someone who isn't impressed by her achievements, who actually gets bored when she slides into performance mode, who loves the version of her that's uncertain, messy, still figuring things out. They had a fight last week. The old Sarah would have shut down completely, retreated behind walls of cold silence, or exploded with that exiled rage she spent so long denying. The integrated Sarah did something she never could have done before. She stayed present. She felt the anger rising and said, "I'm really angry right now. I need a minute to figure out what's actually happening before I say something I don't mean." She took that minute. She recognized that underneath the anger was fear, fear of being misunderstood, fear of losing connection. She came back and said, "I'm scared we're not really seeing each other right now. Can we slow down?" The fight didn't dissolve into false harmony. They still disagreed, but they stayed connected through the disagreement. That's what integrated people can do. They can hold conflict and connection at the same time. Here's what most people don't understand about integration. It's not the absence of inner conflict. It's the capacity to hold inner conflict without fragmenting. The unintegrated person experiences contradiction as emergency. When they feel both love and resentment toward someone, they panic. "I can't feel both. I must be a terrible person." So they split. They exile the resentment into shadow and perform only love. Or they exile the love and become consumed by resentment. Either way, they fracture. They become less whole. The integrated person experiences contradiction as reality. Of course, you feel both love and resentment toward the same person. Of course, you want both solitude and connection. Of course, you're both confident in your abilities and uncertain about your path. This isn't a problem to solve. It's the human condition to inhabit. Jung understood this deeply. He wrote, "The psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. That is to say, when the individual remains undivided and does not become conscious of his inner opposite, the world must perforce act out the conflict and be torn into opposing halves." Read that last part again. The world must perforce act out the conflict. This is why integration isn't just personal transformation. It's collective necessity. When you refuse to hold your own contradictions, when you split yourself into acceptable and unacceptable parts, you don't eliminate the unacceptable parts. You project them onto other people, onto groups, onto entire populations. The person who cannot hold their own capacity for cruelty sees cruelty everywhere except in themselves. They find enemies to punish, scapegoats to blame. Their unintegrated shadow doesn't disappear. It manifests as the evil other that must be destroyed. The person who cannot hold their own vulnerability sees weakness everywhere and despises it. They become the bully, the dominator, the one who crushes in others what they refuse to acknowledge in themselves. This is how unintegrated individuals create collective nightmares. This is how shadow projection becomes social violence. This is how the refusal to become whole contributes to the fragmentation of everything around you. But integration, Your integration begins to reverse this pattern. Let me give you what I call the wholeness checklist. These are the signs you're beginning to operate from the integrated self, rather than the fragmented ego. This isn't about being perfect. It's about noticing the quality of your consciousness. 1. You can feel conflicting emotions without needing to resolve them immediately. You can be excited about a new opportunity and anxious about what it will require. You can love someone deeply and be genuinely frustrated with them. You can feel proud of your growth and ashamed of how long it took. These contradictions no longer create crisis. They create depth. 2. You can receive criticism without either collapsing or defending. When someone points out something you did that caused harm, you don't spiral into "I'm a terrible person," collapse, or "they're being too sensitive," defend. You can hold the complexity. I'm generally a decent person, and I did something hurtful, and I can learn from this, and I don't need to make this mean something catastrophic about my entire identity. 3. You can be with other people's unintegrated selves without getting triggered. This is the real test. Someone projecting their shadow onto you no longer hooks you the way it used to, not because you're spiritually superior, but because you've met that same shadow material in yourself. You've sat with your own capacity for pettiness, rage, jealousy, cruelty. So when you see it in others, you recognize it. You don't need to defend against it or absorb it. You can hold steady. Sarah told me something recently that perfectly captures this. She said, "A client went off on me last month, accused me of not caring about their project, said some really unfair things. 3 years ago, that would have destroyed me for days or made me furiously defensive. But this time I could just see what was happening. They were stressed, projecting, acting out their own anxiety. I didn't take it personally. I could stay compassionate and firm at the same time. I said, 'I hear you're really frustrated. That's not an accurate representation of my commitment, and we need to find a different way to communicate.' And then I let it go, completely. 4. Your confidence is no longer dependent on external validation. You know your value not because others affirm it, but because you've done the work of knowing yourself. You faced your shadow, owned your projections, recognized your patterns. That deep self-knowledge creates a stability that external circumstances can't shake. You can receive praise without inflating, criticism without deflating. You're anchored in something more real than opinion. 5. You can be serious and playful, strong and vulnerable, confident and uncertain, often in the same hour. The integrated person has range. They're not locked into a single emotional register. They can be the powerful leader in one moment and the uncertain student in the next. They can be deeply earnest about meaning and purpose, then make a ridiculous joke 5 minutes later. This isn't inconsistency, it's wholeness. You contain multitudes and you're no longer afraid to show them. 6. You can acknowledge your impact on others without it destroying your self-worth. When you realize you've hurt someone, disappointed them, failed to show up the way they needed, you can own it, fully, without defensive justification. I see how my actions affected you, and I'm genuinely sorry. Not because you're performing apology, but because you can hold being generally good and having caused specific harm. These aren't contradictory. They're the reality of being human and in relationship. 7. You're less interested in being right and more interested in being real. The ego needs to be right. It needs to win arguments, prove points, defend positions. The self is interested in truth, even when truth is uncomfortable, even when it means admitting you were wrong, even when it complicates your narrative about yourself. You can say, "I thought I understood this, but I'm realizing I don't," without it feeling like failure. It's just learning, growing, becoming. Where are you on this checklist? Be honest. Integration isn't binary. You're not either whole or fragmented. You're moving along a spectrum, integrating layer by layer, learning to hold more and more of yourself without splitting apart. Some of these you might be solid on. Others might still trigger that familiar fragmentation response. That's not failure, that's information. That's the self showing you where the next layer of work needs to happen. Here's the ultimate paradox of this entire journey, and it's something Jung understood, but that most people miss entirely. Individuation, this whole process of becoming deeply, authentically yourself, doesn't make you less connected to others. It makes you more connected. I know that sounds backwards. We're taught to believe that becoming an individual means separating, distinguishing, setting yourself apart, that the more yourself you become, the more alone you'll be. But the opposite is true. Profoundly, mysteriously true. The persona creates false connection. When you're performing a role, presenting a carefully curated version of yourself, you're connecting persona to persona. It feels safe because there's no real vulnerability, but it's also empty, hollow. You can spend decades in relationships where you're never actually seen, never actually met, because the real you never shows up. The integrated self creates real connection. When you've done the work of knowing yourself, including the shadow, including the unacceptable parts, including the whole messy truth of who you are, you can finally meet others from that same depth. You're no longer protecting yourself from their judgment because you've already faced your own inner judge. You're no longer hiding your darkness because you know your darkness isn't the enemy. Unconsciousness is. You're no longer performing competence or confidence or whatever else you think you need to be, because you've realized that performance creates isolation. Sarah said something about this that made me pause for a long time. She said, "The more myself I become, the more I can actually see other people. When I was performing all the time, I couldn't really see anyone else. I was too busy managing my image, monitoring their reactions, making sure the mask stayed in place. But now, I see people. Really see them. I see their fears, their shadows, their performances. Not to judge them. I can't judge them anymore because I know those same parts exist in me. I see them with, compassion, recognition, both. That's it. That's the transformation Jung was pointing toward. He wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." But here's what most people miss. This transformation only happens when you bring your whole personality to the meeting. Not just the acceptable parts, not just the persona, not just the light. When two integrated people meet, two people who've done the shadow work, who've faced their own darkness, who've stopped performing and started being, something alchemical happens. They recognize each other, they see each other, and in that seeing, both are changed. David experienced this recently. Remember David? The man whose perfect life fell apart when his shadow finally overwhelmed his persona. He's been building his new life for 2 years now. Different career, different priorities, different relationship to himself. And last month, he met someone at a workshop, another person doing this work. They had a conversation that lasted 4 hours. He told me about it with this sense of wonder in his voice. We weren't performing for each other at all. We both just showed up as ourselves, including the messy parts, including the still figuring it out parts. And it was the most real conversation I've had maybe ever. I felt seen in a way I didn't even know was possible. And I could see them too, really see them. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't even about forming some permanent relationship. It was just two conscious humans actually meeting each other, and it changed something in me. I didn't know connection could feel like that. That's what integration makes possible. Not the elimination of connection, but the deepening of it into something real. Now I need to tell you something that might be difficult to hear, but it's crucial you understand it. Your integration isn't just about you. It never was. Every time you integrate a piece of shadow, every time you stop projecting your unowned darkness onto others, every time you choose consciousness over unconsciousness, you're doing something that affects the collective field. Jung understood this. He wrote, "As far as we can discern, the sole purpose of human existence is to kindle a light in the darkness of mere being. You are that light. Not because you're special or chosen or superior. You are that light because you've chosen to become conscious. And consciousness, real consciousness, hard-won through shadow work and persona integration, is what the world desperately needs. Think about how much suffering in the world comes from unintegrated shadow. How much violence, how much cruelty, how much systemic oppression can be traced back to collective shadow projection. Groups who cannot acknowledge their own capacity for evil find enemies to embody that evil for them. Nations that cannot face their own historical shadows project virtue onto themselves and monstrosity onto others. Individuals who cannot hold their own shame find scapegoats to carry it for them. This is how the unintegrated psyche creates hell on earth. This is how shadow becomes social structure, how personal unconsciousness becomes collective nightmare. But you, by doing your work, by integrating your shadow, by becoming conscious of your projections, you withdraw your participation from that collective nightmare. You stop feeding the beast of shadow projection. You stop creating enemies to punish for crimes that live inside you. You stop demanding purity from others that you can't achieve in yourself. This doesn't mean you become passive or tolerant of actual harm. The integrated person can hold strong moral positions and fierce boundaries. But those positions and boundaries come from consciousness, not from projected shadow. They come from genuine values, not from the need to exile your own darkness by punishing it in others. Sarah told me about a staff meeting where this played out in real time. Her team was discussing a mistake one of their newer employees had made, a significant error that cost the company money. Several people around the table were getting vicious, calling for immediate termination, using language that was way out of proportion to the actual mistake. The old Sarah might have either joined the attack, exiling her own fear of failure through punishment of someone else, or remained silent, avoiding conflict, maintaining her nice persona. The integrated Sarah did something different. She said, "I notice we're all being pretty harsh right now. This was a significant mistake and we need to address it. But I'm wondering if there's something else happening here. Are we this angry because of the error itself, or because it's triggering our own fear of making mistakes? Because I know for me, my first response was anger, and when I looked underneath it, it was fear. Fear that if someone on my team can make this kind of mistake, maybe I'm not the leader I think I am. Maybe I'm more vulnerable than I want to admit." The room went quiet. She continued, "So let's separate those things. Let's address the actual error with appropriate consequences, but let's not make this person carry our collective anxiety about our own fallibility." One of her colleagues said, "That really landed for me. I was definitely doing that. Thank you." That's what one integrated person can do in a room full of people acting out their shadows. They can name the unconscious pattern without shaming anyone, offer an alternative, and shift the collective energy toward consciousness. Imagine if more people did this, not as performance, not as spiritual superiority, but as genuine, hard-won integration manifesting in real time. The world changes, not through grand gestures or revolutionary pronouncements, but through individual humans becoming conscious, one shadow integration at a time, one projection withdrawal at a time, one moment of genuine presence at a time. I need to tell you something about myself, something I haven't shared publicly before, because if I'm going to ask you to do this work, to face your shadow, to risk integration, I need to show you that I'm in it too, that this isn't me speaking from some mountain of achieved enlightenment. This is me speaking from inside the ongoing process. 6 months ago, I noticed something about myself that I didn't want to see. I realized I was using my knowledge of Jung, my understanding of shadow work, as a new kind of persona, a more sophisticated mask. I'm the person who's done the work. I'm conscious. I understand the psyche. And I was using that identity to avoid facing a new layer of shadow that had been growing in the darkness. I was jealous, deeply, painfully jealous of someone in my field who was getting recognition I wanted. And instead of acknowledging the jealousy, instead of sitting with it and exploring what it was showing me, I was explaining it away. That's their shadow material showing, their need for validation. I'm beyond that kind of ego attachment. Do you see the trap? I was using shadow consciousness as a defense against shadow itself. I was performing integrated person to avoid actually integrating a new piece of shadow. My partner called me on it, gently but directly. You talk about him a lot. You notice everything he does. You have explanations for why his work isn't as substantial as it seems. That's not consciousness, that's envy pretending to be analysis. I wanted to defend myself, explain why she was wrong, list all the legitimate critiques I had. But something stopped me. Maybe it was years of doing this work. Maybe it was grace. I don't know. But I stopped, and I felt it. The jealousy, the inadequacy underneath it, the fear that I wasn't enough, that my work wasn't enough, that someone else's success somehow diminished mine. It was humbling, painful, embarrassing, honestly. Here I am, teaching about shadow integration, and I'd created a whole new shadow pocket I wasn't looking at. But that's the thing about this work, it never ends. Integration isn't a destination you arrive at and then you're done. It's a practice, a orientation, a commitment to continuing to look, continuing to integrate, continuing to bring consciousness to whatever emerges from the darkness. I had to sit with that jealousy, really sit with it, not explain it away, not transcend it with spiritual concepts, not perform shadow work to impress anyone, just feel it, own it, recognize it as part of my human complexity. And then I had to do something harder. I had to congratulate him, genuinely. I sent him a message acknowledging his work, its value, its impact, not as performance, not to prove I was over the jealousy, but because I could finally hold both. I'm genuinely envious of his success, and I genuinely appreciate his work. Both are true. Both can exist in me simultaneously. That's integration. That's what wholeness actually looks like. Not the absence of difficult emotions, but the capacity to hold them consciously, without letting them control you or define you or remain unconscious where they cause harm. I'm telling you this because I need you to know I'm not separate from you in this. I'm not the enlightened teacher, and you're the struggling student. We're all in this together, all working with our shadows, all learning to integrate layer by layer. The goal isn't to become perfect, it's to become conscious, to become whole, to become increasingly able to hold all of yourself without fragmenting, without projecting, without creating suffering for yourself and others through unconsciousness. Let me tell you what David and Sarah's lives look like now, 3 years into their integration journeys, not because they've arrived at some final destination, but because their lives show what this work creates when you commit to it. David still works, but not in finance anymore. He's a consultant now, helping companies think about sustainable business practices. It's less money than he used to make, significantly less. But he told me recently, I wake up most mornings and I want to do the work I'm doing. That feeling, wanting to engage with my life, I didn't even know it was possible. I spent 40 years performing success, and I never once actually wanted to do the work I was doing. His relationship with his daughter has transformed. She's in college now, and she told him something last month that made him cry. "Dad, I don't know how to explain this, but you feel like a real person now. You used to feel like, I don't know, like you were always performing successful dad. But now you're just you. You're uncertain sometimes. You admit when you don't know things. You ask me questions and actually listen to the answers. It's like I finally get to know the actual human who's my father." That's what integration gives you. The capacity to be met by the people you love. Not your persona, not your performance. You. Sarah's business is thriving, but not because she's performing achievement anymore. It's thriving because she's finally bringing her whole self to the work, including the intuition she used to suppress, the creativity she thought didn't belong in serious business, the vulnerability she thought was weakness. She gave a keynote speech last year at an industry conference. She started by telling a story about failure, a project she'd completely mismanaged early in her career because she was too proud to ask for help. The audience was riveted. Afterward, people kept coming up to her saying, "Thank you for being real. Thank you for showing us that perfection isn't the goal." One woman said, "I've been in this industry for 15 years, and I've never heard someone at your level admit to failing at anything. It made me realize how much energy I've been spending pretending I have it all figured out." That's what happens when you stop performing and start being. You give others permission to do the same. Your integration invites integration in others. Your consciousness sparks consciousness in the field around you. Both David and Sarah will tell you the same thing. Life isn't easier now. In some ways it's harder. They feel more. They're more aware of their impact. They can't hide from themselves anymore. They can't retreat into comfortable unconsciousness when things get difficult. But they'll also tell you it's real now. Their lives feel like their own. Their relationships have depth and substance. Their work has meaning. Their struggles are genuine rather than performative. Their joys aren't tainted by the constant effort of maintaining masks. They're whole, not perfect, not finished, not beyond difficulty or pain or contradiction, but whole. And that wholeness, that hard-won, deeply inhabited integration, radiates out into every aspect of their lives and into the lives of everyone around them. Jung wrote something toward the end of his life that I think captures what we've been exploring. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. A privilege, not a right, not an inevitability, not something that happens automatically as you age. A privilege, something you have to choose, something you have to work for, something you have to be willing to be broken open to receive. Most people never claim this privilege. They live their entire lives as someone they think they should be. They die with their real self, the integrated, whole, conscious self, still buried under layers of persona, still fragmented by unintegrated shadow, still unexpressed and unknown. But you're here. You've stayed through 12 chapters now. You've been willing to look at your persona, face your shadow, understand your projections, witness your breaking, commit to your rebuilding. That willingness, that rare, courageous willingness, is what makes integration possible. Living as an integrated self, as a whole human being, doesn't mean you've transcended your humanity. It means you've finally inhabited it. Fully. Including the darkness, including the contradictions, including the parts you spent decades trying to exile or deny or perfect away. You've learned to hold paradox, to be strong and vulnerable, confident and uncertain, serious and playful, generous and boundaried, loving and capable of anger, disciplined and spontaneous, certain about your values and humble about your understanding. You've stopped splitting yourself into acceptable and unacceptable parts. You've stopped fragmenting under pressure. You've stopped performing for an audience that doesn't exist. You've become you, wholly, consciously, courageously, you. And here's what Jung knew, what he tried to tell us, what this whole journey has been pointing toward. When you become whole, when you integrate shadow, dissolve unnecessary persona, and learn to live from the self, you don't just transform your own life. You change the field around you. You withdraw your participation from collective shadow projection. You stop creating suffering through unconsciousness. You become a source of consciousness in a world desperate for it. Your integration is a gift to the collective, not because you're special or superior, but because consciousness itself is rare, precious, necessary. Every person who does this work, who faces their shadow, owns their projections, integrates their contradictions, makes consciousness more possible for everyone else. You become what Jung called a light in the darkness of mere being, not through grand gestures or dramatic transformation, but through the simple, profound act of becoming conscious, of becoming whole, of becoming, finally, yourself. So here's the question that matters now. Will you claim this privilege? Will you do the work of becoming who you truly are? Will you commit to wholeness even when fragmentation is easier? To consciousness even when unconsciousness is more comfortable? To integration even when you're terrified of what you'll find? The choice is yours. It's always been yours. But know this, the world needs your wholeness, not your perfection, not your performance, not your carefully curated persona. The world needs the real, integrated, conscious version of you that emerges when you finally stop running from yourself. Take a moment right now and ask yourself, where am I still fragmenting? Where am I still performing? Where am I still exiling parts of myself into shadow rather than integrating them into consciousness? Not to judge yourself, just to know, just to see, because integration begins with seeing, always. It begins with the willingness to look at the whole truth of who you are, the light and the dark, the strength and the vulnerability, the beauty and the shadow, and say, yes, this is me, all of it, and I'm ready to become whole. That readiness, that willingness is everything. Welcome to integration. Welcome to wholeness. Welcome to the privilege of becoming who you truly are. The work continues, it always does. But now you're no longer doing it from fragmentation. You're doing it from the self, from consciousness, from the integrated center of your being that can hold everything without splitting apart. And that changes everything. Here's something I need to tell you that might be difficult to hear. This isn't over. You've done the work. You've faced your shadow. You've integrated layers of unconscious material. You've dissolved the rigid persona and started living from something more real, more whole. You've felt the relief, the expansion, the sense of finally becoming yourself. And now I need to prepare you for something that most people doing this work don't expect. It will happen again. Not in the same way, not with the same intensity necessarily, not even the same content, but the cycle, the breaking, the dark night, the disintegration that precedes reintegration. It doesn't end. It evolves. This is chapter 13. This is about what happens when you understand that transformation isn't a one-time event. It's a spiral, and consciousness doesn't exempt you from future breakings. It changes your relationship to them. Most people approach spiritual or psychological transformation with an unconscious assumption. If I do the work, if I integrate my shadow, if I become conscious, then I'll be done. I'll have achieved some permanent state of integration that won't be disrupted. Jung would have laughed at this, not cruelly, but with the recognition of someone who knows better. He understood something that most teachers don't adequately prepare people for. The psyche doesn't integrate once and then remain static. It integrates in layers, and each layer of integration eventually creates the conditions for the next breaking. Why? Because as you become more conscious, you become capable of handling more difficult material. The psyche knows this. So it brings you deeper content, older wounds, more subtle shadows, more complex contradictions that you couldn't have faced earlier in your journey. It's not punishment, it's not failure, it's not evidence that your previous integration wasn't real. It's evolution. It's the psyche's intelligence continuously offering you opportunities to become more whole, more conscious, more fully yourself. But if you don't understand this, if you think you should be past this kind of disruption, then when the next breaking comes, you'll experience it as catastrophic failure. You'll think you did something wrong, or that your previous work was meaningless, or that you're somehow fundamentally broken in a way that can't be healed. None of that is true. What's true is this. You've reached the limit of what your current level of consciousness can contain, and the psyche is preparing you for the next expansion. Let me show you what this looks like. David, our financial executive who 3 years ago had his life completely dismantled when his shadow overwhelmed his persona, thought he was done. He'd rebuilt his life on more authentic foundations. He had a career that felt meaningful, relationships with depth, a sense of himself that felt real and integrated. Then 2 months ago, his wife told him she wanted to separate, not because he'd become a bad partner, actually, in some ways, the opposite. She said, "You've changed so much, and I'm grateful for that, but I feel like I don't know how to be with this version of you. You're asking for depths of emotional connection that I don't even know if I want. You're vulnerable in ways that make me uncomfortable. You're bringing up things I thought we'd agreed to keep buried. And I'm realizing that I liked the old version better, the performing version, the one who didn't ask so much of me." David was devastated. He called me in the middle of the night, voice thick with pain and confusion. "I did the work," he said. "I became conscious. I integrated my shadow. I stopped performing. And now my marriage is ending because I did the work. How is that fair? How does that make any sense?" I let him sit with that question for a while. Then I said, "You're experiencing the next breaking. The psyche isn't done with you yet." He was quiet. Then, "I thought the breaking was supposed to lead somewhere stable. I thought once you integrated, you got to, I don't know, stay integrated, live from that place permanently." "You do live from that place," I told him, "but that place isn't static, it's alive. And living systems break and rebuild continuously. The spiral doesn't end, David, it goes deeper." What David was experiencing, what you will experience if you stay on this path, is what Jung called the ongoing work of individuation. It doesn't stop. There is no final arrival. There is no permanent state of integration that protects you from future disruption. But here's what changes. Your relationship to the breaking, your capacity to meet it, your understanding of what it means and what it's for. The first breaking, the one David experienced 3 years ago, the one that shattered his persona and forced him to face his shadow, felt like annihilation because he didn't understand what was happening. He thought his life was falling apart. He thought he was failing. He thought the darkness was the enemy. This second breaking is different, not easier necessarily, still painful, still disorienting, still requiring surrender to forces larger than his ego's control. But he knows something now that he didn't know before. He knows that breaking precedes building. He knows that the psyche doesn't dismantle you for no reason. He knows that what feels like destruction is actually preparation for a deeper level of consciousness. A week after that midnight phone call, David called me again. Different tone, still grief in his voice, but something else too, something steadier. He said, "I'm starting to understand. This isn't about my marriage failing because I did something wrong. This is about my marriage was built on a version of me that doesn't exist anymore." And she's right. She did sign up for the performing version. She built her life around that. And now I'm asking her to relate to someone completely different. That's not fair to blame her for not wanting that. "What else are you seeing?" I asked. I'm seeing that I have shadow around partnership itself that I never looked at. I thought doing my individual work would be enough. But there's a whole layer about how I relate to intimacy, to vulnerability in relationship, to the terror of being truly seen by someone. That's still unconscious. This breaking is bringing that up. It's not about my marriage failing. It's about the psyche showing me the next layer of work. That's the consciousness shift. That's what happens when you understand the cyclical nature of this work. The first time you break, you experience it as victim. Something is happening to you and you don't understand why, and you just want it to stop. The second time, or third, or fourth, you experience it differently. You're not a victim anymore. You're a practitioner. You recognize the pattern. You know the breaking serves a purpose, even when you can't see it yet. You know how to navigate the darkness because you've been there before. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." Notice he didn't say accept oneself once, completely, continuously, including the parts that emerge only after you think you've already done the work, including the shadows you couldn't see until you'd integrated the first layer, including the personas you don't realize you're still performing until life strips them away. Let me explain something about how the psyche works, because if you understand this, the cyclical nature of breaking and integration will make more sense. The unconscious doesn't reveal everything at once. It can't. You're not capable of handling the full truth of your psyche all at one time. It would overwhelm you, shatter you completely. The ego isn't strong enough to hold that much reality simultaneously. So the unconscious is merciful. It reveals in layers. It brings you what you're capable of integrating at each stage of development. It waits until you've strengthened through one cycle before it initiates the next. This is why you can do significant shadow work, feel genuinely transformed, then 5 years later discover a whole new pocket of shadow you never even suspected was there. It was always there, but you weren't ready to see it. Your consciousness wasn't developed enough to hold it yet. David's first breaking brought up his relationship with achievement, success, external validation, all the persona material he'd built his identity around. That was the layer he was ready to face 3 years ago. That was what his consciousness could handle. But underneath that layer, his terror of genuine intimacy, his unconscious belief that if someone really saw him, all of him, including the weak parts, the uncertain parts, the still figuring it out parts, they would leave. So he'd built his entire relational life around not being fully seen. Even his marriage, which he thought was intimate, had been built on careful performance. He couldn't have faced that 3 years ago. He wasn't ready. His ego was too fragile, his persona too rigid, his shadow too powerful. He needed to integrate the first layer before the psyche would show him the second. But now he's strong enough. Now he has enough consciousness, enough integration, enough ego strength to face this deeper layer without completely falling apart. So the psyche brings the next breaking, not as punishment, as invitation, as recognition of his readiness for deeper work. This is how individuation actually works, not as linear progress toward some final state of completion, but as spiral descent into deeper and deeper layers of the unconscious, each layer requiring its own breaking and integration, each cycle preparing you for the next. Think of it like this. Imagine your psyche as an ancient temple with many levels descending into the earth. You start at the surface level, the persona, the conscious identity, the parts of yourself you already know and claim. The first breaking takes you down to the first subterranean level. There you encounter shadow material you never knew existed. You do the work of integration. You bring consciousness to that level. You feel transformed. But there are deeper levels still. Older material, more fundamental wounds, more subtle shadows, more complex contradictions, and you can't skip levels. You can't jump from the first subterranean level to the fifth. You have to descend layer by layer, integrating as you go. Each descent requires a breaking, a dissolution of the identity structure you built at the previous level, a surrender to not knowing, a willingness to have your current understanding of yourself dismantled so you can meet what lies beneath. The people who give up on this path are usually the ones who expected one heroic journey into the underworld, and then a return to normal life, forever changed. They did the first descent, felt transformed, and then when the psyche called them to the second descent, they said, "No, I'm done. I did my work. This shouldn't be happening again." But the people who become truly conscious, truly whole, they understand that the path descends continuously. They learn to recognize the signs that the next breaking is coming. They learn to meet it not with resistance, but with a kind of readiness, even reverence, not because they enjoy suffering, not because they're spiritual masochists who seek out pain, but because they've learned to trust the intelligence of the process. They know that the psyche doesn't break you arbitrarily. It breaks you strategically, precisely when you're ready for the next level of consciousness, and not a moment before.